Greetings, everyone. I'm here to assist you today. If you're using this video to drift off, take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel before you doze off. What's your location, and what time are you tuning in right now? Take a moment to unwind and enjoy the peace. I never imagined I would open up about this, but it's time to release it from my mind. The events of last month in that cabin in Montana continue to haunt my nights. I'm not someone who gets frightened easily. Additionally, I've experienced solo camping numerous times and have consistently felt at ease with being alone. Yet this occasion was distinct. I discovered the cabin on a rentals page while on the hunt for a serene spot to complete my novel. The cost for a 2-week stay was quite fair, particularly given the spaciousness of the property. A 2-bedroom cabin set on 15 acres of private land adjacent to a national forest. The owner, Dave, appeared friendly in his emails, mentioning that he lived about 2 hours away and wouldn't be present during my visit. However, he provided clear instructions and emergency contacts, ensuring a smooth experience. The initial 3 days of my retreat were precisely what I craved: complete solitude. Just me, my laptop, and the serene embrace of towering pine trees and breathtaking mountain vistas. Although cell service was non-existent, the cabin offered satellite internet, allowing me to conduct research and send emails when necessary. My nearest neighbor resided 2 miles down a dirt road, and not a single car had passed since my arrival. However, on the 4th morning, I awoke early, around 6 a.m., and headed to the front porch to brew my coffee, just as I had done each day before. As I looked around, I spotted a small wooden chair, reminiscent of those found in elementary classrooms, positioned right in the heart of the garden, about 50 feet from the cabin, just sitting there quietly. Initially, I considered the possibility that it had always been there, slipping past my notice. However, I hadn't been on that porch daily, scrutinizing that very spot. The chair was unmistakably brand new. I stepped outside to investigate, wondering if perhaps a bear had pulled it from its hiding place. Although that didn't make sense, it was dusty but intact and positioned directly facing my bedroom window. A shiver ran down my spine when I noticed that there were no drag marks on the dirt around. Someone had placed it carefully there. Took it inside and emailed Dave asking if he had been there or if any maintenance workers had a visit scheduled. He replied pretty quickly, saying no, that he hadn't been there and that no one else should be on the property. He suggested that maybe kids from nearby properties were making jokes. He wasn't convinced. The nearest properties were miles away, and this didn't feel like a teenage mischief. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I got up several times to check the windows, but between the darkness and my reflection in the glass I couldn't see much. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning. The next morning my heart almost stopped. There was an old photograph lying on the road of gravel about 30 feet. Closer to the cabin than where the chair had been showed a family standing in front of what appeared to be this same cabin. But the photo had to be from the 60s, because of the clothes they were wearing. I didn't recognize any of the faces, but they were all smiling at the camera, except for a girl of about 12 years old, who was staring to her left with unsteady hands. I captured the photo indoors and then dedicated the next hour to comparing it to the cabin. The two structures were nearly identical. While the renovations were evident, the trees in the background remained unchanged, albeit appearing much smaller in the photo. I emailed the photo to Dave, inquiring if he recognized the family. This time, I received no reply. That night, the moment I drifted off to sleep, I positioned a sturdy dresser firmly against the door of the house. By my bedside, I kept a flashlight and hiking poles at the ready. Each time I began to drift off, the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside would pull me back to alertness. Yet, whenever I shone the flashlight toward the window, I found nothing but darkness. On the 3rd morning, I found myself contemplating a departure. Just 20 feet from my door lay a curious collection of children's toys. A metal truck, a few dirty porcelain dolls with cracked faces, and a jump rope intricately knotted into a perfect circle. At the center of this odd arrangement was a piece of paper, scrawled with childish pencil writing that read, "You want to play?" My hands trembled as I snapped photos of everything with my phone. For hours, I found myself pacing the cabin, torn between the urge to leave and an inexplicable force keeping me rooted in place. Was it curiosity, pride, or sheer stubbornness? I chided myself for being absurd, convinced this was merely someone's cruel prank. Writing proved futile. My focus shattered every few minutes as I rose to peer out the windows at dusk. I could have sworn I spotted a fleeting shadow darting through the trees. I tried to rationalize it as a deer or a moose, but deep down, I sensed it was something else. Then the sounds began. First, a slow, deliberate scraping against the gravel, pausing intermittently. Next, a distant humming, a childlike voice, too far to discern the tune, yet unmistakably human. In that dark room, I clutched my hiking poles, paralyzed by fear, too terrified to look outside, yet too anxious to ignore the unsettling noises around 2 o'clock. As dawn broke, a gentle knocking started on the windows, soft at first, then growing more persistent. It drifted from one window to another, enveloping the cabin in an eerie embrace. Shadows flickered just beyond my sight, too dim to discern any features. The tapping was accompanied by a laughter that felt unsettling, hollow, almost mechanical in nature. As dawn finally broke, I felt a surge of panic at what lay just 10 feet from my door. There it was, a perfect circle of 8 little wooden chairs, all facing the cabin. In the center sat a larger chair, and perched upon it was a porcelain doll dressed in a hand-sewn outfit that mirrored the fabric of the girl in the old photograph. There was no sign of any packaging, and instinctively, I bolted. I didn't dare look back. I was in my car and speeding down that dirt road before my mind could catch up. Once I had a signal, I called Dave, leaving him a frantic voicemail about a family emergency. I mailed him the keys from the nearest town. A few days later, he wrote to me, inquiring about the chairs. He mentioned that when his housekeeping team arrived to prepare the cabin for the next guest, there was nothing. No chairs, no toys, no doll, just an old photograph. On the kitchen counter lay a family photo in front of the cabin, neatly attached to the mail. This wasn't the same photo I had discovered. While it was captured in the same location, it featured a different family. In the background, just barely discernible in the cabin's window, was a pale face gazing out. A girl, perhaps 12 years old, wearing that same hauntingly blank expression. I have both photos stored on my phone, yet I find it difficult to bring myself to view them. I've delved into the history of the cabin, but to my surprise, there's a scarcity of information out there. Dave ceased to reply to my emails when I inquired about past incidents or fatalities on the property. In the quiet of the night, echoes of that familiar hum linger in my mind, even from hundreds of miles away. Just last week, I stumbled upon a charming little wooden chair. In the parking lot of my apartment complex, directly facing my bedroom window, I'm preparing to move out next month. Uncertainty loomed over the woods, shrouded in mystery. Yet my desire to continue the game I had embarked upon remained unquenched. At times, I can't help but ponder whether my escape only deepened the complexity of it all. The idea of him choosing to trail me home rather than remaining locked away in that cabin still sends shivers down my spine. What transpired during my journey last month on the overnight train from Boston to Providence? I've taken that route countless times for work, but ever since that night, stepping onto a train has become impossible for me. I needed to wrap up a few quarterly reports, and I was completely drained. The platform at South Station was nearly deserted, with only a handful of passengers lingering, each one deliberately avoiding eye contact, embodying the essence of typical night travelers. As the train pulled in, I settled into my preferred spot in the middle car, renowned for its cozy warmth during the winter months. Initially, everything seemed routine. I nestled into my window seat, placed my bag on the vacant seat beside me, and took out my phone to check my emails. The car was filled with perhaps 8 individuals, a couple of students lost in their headphones, a woman clad in a nurse's uniform, and several other workers, all sharing a common vibe of simply yearning to return home. It was then that I spotted him. Nestled in the back row of the car, he donned a simple gray suit that managed to exude an air of both sophistication and wear. He was unremarkable in many ways, yet there lingered an unsettling aura around him. The feeling was akin to being observed, but even more unsettling. Whenever I looked his way, he stayed perfectly still, hands neatly folded in his lap. He stood motionless, his gaze unwavering. Yet time and time again I found myself compelled to take another look. By the third time, my stomach was in knots. He had descended. He had shifted seats, now 4 rows nearer. He hadn't noticed any movement. He hadn't caught a sound. He was simply in a new seat, alongside the woman in the nurse's uniform. Sitting across the aisle, she cast a glance my way. The expression on her face revealed that she had noticed it as well. She gently shook her head, as if attempting to persuade herself that it was merely a figment of her imagination. I had something to share with her, but what exactly should I say? A mysterious figure suddenly appears on the train, sending chills down your spine. I chose to remain quiet, gripping my phone tightly until my knuckles turned pale. The train swayed softly, creating a soothing rhythm. As we navigated the shadows between stations, each reflection in the window sent a thrill through my heart. I sensed it lingering behind, palpable and unchanging. Approximately 15 minutes later, the car's lights flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly. Yet, once they found their balance, I sensed it. I could hear the nurse breathing softly, despite my better judgment. I glanced back. At that moment, I found myself halfway down the aisle of the car, maintaining the same posture and vacant expression, with the closest student just 6 rows ahead. He removed his headphones and stood utterly still, his gaze fixed ahead. The car was filled with an oppressive tension, the air thick and heavy, wrapping around everyone inside like a dense fog. My hands trembled as I attempted to make a call. Whether to the police or Amtrak security, I couldn't decide. I was completely cut off. Naturally, I was completely cut off. The nurse held her bag tightly, using it as a shield, desperately trying to catch the student's attention. Yet, no one seemed willing to be the first to acknowledge the unfolding situation. The lights flicker once more, plunging us into a deeper darkness this time. 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. In that silence, I sensed something unusual. It wasn't footsteps or any typical movement. It was a slow, wet sound, reminiscent of someone running their tongue over their lips. When the lights flickered back on, it was closer, just 3 rows behind me, close enough to finally see his face with unsettling clarity. That image still haunts me. His features were distorted, as if an AI had attempted to recreate a human face but faltered on the details. His eyes were too far apart, his smile stretched just slightly beyond the norm, and his skin had a waxy sheen, almost artificial. But the most chilling aspect was his unchanging expression. An empty gaze that now revealed his eyes were unfocused, mere black marbles set in clay. The nurse quickly grabbed her bag and turned to the back of the car. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "We should." Suddenly, the lights went out again. This time, the darkness was complete. Not the usual dimness of the train, but something heavier, as if the very blackness had taken on a physical form. I could hear movements, heavy breaths, and then the sound of someone sobbing. That wet noise grew closer, accompanied by a low murmur, a guttural hum that felt almost human but was strangely off, as if someone was struggling to recall how to produce a sound with their throat. When the lights flickered back on, I screamed. He was right behind me. I could smell him, a sweet and sickly scent reminiscent of overripe fruit mixed with damp leather. The nurse was gone, the students vanished, and all the passengers had rushed to other cars when the lights went out. I found myself alone with him, paralyzed, unable to breathe, acutely aware of his presence just inches from my head. Then I heard a precise and meticulous whisper right next to my ear, "Your stop is next." But it wasn't my stop. I still had 20 minutes to go. Just then, the train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the brakes grinding, even though no station was in sight, only darkness beyond the window. The train came to a complete stop, and the doors opened with their usual hiss. "Your stop," the voice repeated, even closer now. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't grab my bag. I didn't look back. I just bolted out of that car and threw myself onto the empty platform where I shouldn't have been. The doors. As the train departed, the doors shut swiftly behind me. I took one final glance through the window. He occupied my seat, his face now pressed against the glass, that smile stretching impossibly wide, his vacant eyes locked onto mine. As the train vanished into the shadows, I remained rooted to the spot, trembling with my phone clutched tightly, still devoid of signal, the chill enveloping me. It seeped into my very being. I was oblivious to its location, just an aged, crumbling platform featuring a solitary blinking light on a battered bench. I waited anxiously, my heart racing with every noise, until the first train of the morning finally pulled in. Interestingly, when I attempt to explore that platform, I find no trace of it whatsoever. I've thoroughly examined every map of the Boston-Providence line, and there's absolutely nothing indicated along that stretch. I reached out to Amtrak, but they have no record of my ticket for that night, despite the charge on my credit card confirming that I was indeed on that train. Sometimes, as I lie in bed at night, my mind drifts to that voice, that scent, that mischievous smile. But more than anything, I ponder what might have unfolded if I hadn't walked away. Since then, I rely on Uber for my daily commute. The extra expense feels warranted because each time a train glides by, I find myself pondering its stillness, lingering as the lights flicker, patiently awaiting someone to take notice. Occasionally, while I'm alone in my apartment at night, I could swear I hear that damp sound, reminiscent of someone rehearsing. During my 2 years as a guardian, the events of my final shift continue to haunt my thoughts long after the experience. It may seem unbelievable, but I assure you that every detail of this story is true. Nestled on a rugged cliff, the lighthouse stood alone, a solid 5 kilometers from the nearest town. It wasn't a tourist hotspot or anything of the sort. Rather, it served a practical purpose, requiring a dedicated individual to maintain its essential equipment. As I made my way along the familiar path, I ensured everything was in order. Most nights were serene, just me and the rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the rocks. That night began like any other. I completed my routine rounds around 11 p.m. when I spotted a small boat moored at the dock at the foot of the cliff. While it wasn't entirely unusual for fishermen to stop and rest or wait out a storm, this boat stood out. It was empty. No fishing gear, no supplies, just an old vessel, weather-beaten and bobbing gently in the water. I promptly contacted the Coast Guard to report my find, but they informed me they had received no reports of drifting boats. They advised me to keep an eye on it and to notify them if anyone came to claim it. I figured it might belong to someone from the village, and that the owner would eventually return for it. As the clock struck midnight, I dove back into my morning routine. Strange sounds started to echo from the depths of the lighthouse. The sounds that filled the air were far from the typical creaks and moans of an aging structure. Instead, they carried a unique quality, reminiscent of someone stealthily shifting, striving to stay unnoticed. As I made my way downstairs to uncover the source of the sounds, they mysteriously fell silent whenever I arrived at the location they appeared to come from. Yet, with each new floor I reached, the noises would return, beckoning me to follow their elusive trail. As I shifted through the sounds and altered my surroundings, it felt as though someone was toying with me. A sense of unease washed over me as I returned to my room, only to discover my belongings scattered about, not as if a thief had ransacked the place, but rather as if someone had been meticulously inspecting them. My coffee cup was in an unexpected place, my journal had shifted from the shelf to the desk, and my jacket was draped over a different hook. Intriguing details that are small yet peculiar enough to send shivers down my spine. I dashed up the stairs to the flashlight room, the pinnacle of the lighthouse where the lighting equipment resided. It was the sole space secured by a reinforced door, and I possessed the only key. I attempted to make a phone call, but the signal in the lighthouse was consistently poor. The radio was located on the lower floor, and there was no chance of retrieving it again. The footsteps on the snail-threshing floor were slow and deliberate, as if they wanted me to be aware of their approach. They halted right outside the door, and then an unsettling sound emerged, a scratch like nails on metal. A voice followed, and instead of shouting or whispering, I spoke calmly, almost with curiosity. "I've been in your room." A chill coursed through me. "I've read your diary." I found myself frozen, captivated by the way you write. The Soledad was silent for a moment, and I could barely breathe. Then came more scratches at the door. "I've been watching you." I glimpsed her shadow through the gap beneath the door, too tall, too thin, her movements unnaturally fluid. "I knew your routines, your meals, your sleep patterns." My heart pounded in my chest. "Sometimes, as you drift off, I find myself whispering, 'Trying on your clothes.'" My hands trembled with anticipation. I was fond of the blue jacket. I had donned it just that morning while stepping outside. The sea churned restlessly, while the boat remained securely moored to the dock. At 3 a.m., I witnessed its sudden disappearance. There was no sound, no one untied it, it simply ceased to exist. The shadow beneath the door vanished as well. I remained frozen until dawn, mustering the courage to step outside. The lighthouse stood in eerie silence, yet something felt different. My room was in disarray, with items shifted around. The journal lay open to a specific entry I had penned weeks prior, detailing the loneliness that sometimes enveloped the lighthouse. But beneath my words, a shaky hand had scrawled, "You're never alone here, I'm always watching." That very day, I called my supervisor and resigned, certain I would never return. He believed he was losing his mind. The Coast Guard inspected the lighthouse and found no evidence of a break-in. The security cameras revealed nothing unusual, only static during the moments when everything unfolded. I reside in the heart of the city, far removed from the ocean's embrace. Yet, on certain nights, within the confines of my apartment, I hear footsteps ascending stairs that aren't there. Occasionally, I return home to find my belongings slightly askew. Small, unsettling details like a photo turned askance on the shelf or a jacket draped over an unfamiliar hook. Nothing substantial enough to confirm a presence, but just enough to suggest that someone has been here. The lighthouse continues to shine its light. A new hire has been brought on to take my place. Sometimes I ponder the idea of giving him a heads up, advising him to thoroughly inspect the shadowy corners. But what could I possibly say? To be cautious of what resides in the lighthouse and has a penchant for trying on his clothes? He would think I was out of my mind. I've made a firm decision. No more night shifts for me. Now, I triple-check that all doors and windows are securely closed before I drift off to sleep. Even though I understand that if something emerged from the lighthouse, doors might not be necessary for entry, I've spent over 8 years camping solo without ever doubting my safety in the wild, until the events in Maple Creek unfolded. 3 weeks ago, I'm still working through everything, but I feel compelled to put it down on paper while the details are still vivid in my mind. Perhaps someone else has gone through something similar and can offer insights to help me make sense of it all. After taking a few days off from work, I chose to escape to a campground. Maple Creek, located roughly 2 hours north of my home, offers a charmingly secluded experience with no RV hookups, just simple tent sites nestled among the trees. I had visited twice before during the peak season, but this time in mid-October, I expected it to be tranquil. I was right about that. Upon arriving at the gravel parking lot around 2 p.m., I noticed just 2 other cars present, alongside the station. The ranger's site was deserted, a common sight during the off-season. I filled out the self-registration form and selected Site 14, recalling its clearing that was ideal for stargazing. The distance from the parking lot is approximately 400 meters, and that's one of the aspects I appreciated about it. After years of experience, it seems even more distant than the locations nearer to the entrance. In under an hour, my team had expertly assembled my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and neatly organized my kitchen equipment on the picnic table. The weather was simply ideal. Crisp autumn air, a gentle stillness, and that enchanting golden light streaming through the trees. The remainder of my day was dedicated to gathering firewood and capturing images of fascinating mushrooms I stumbled upon near my site, the initial indication that something unusual was afoot. It felt off. It emerged as the sun dipped below the horizon. As I warmed up my dinner, a simple serving of freeze-dried pasta, it struck me that the forest had fallen into an eerie silence. When you find yourself in the great outdoors, you can relate to that eerie silence, the absence of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves, signaling that a predator may be lurking close by. I scanned the surroundings, yet found nothing alarming. However, there was still an underlying sense of unease. It was an unsettling sensation, akin to the eerie awareness of being observed, yet each time you glance back, there's nothing there. I reassured myself that I was just being overly cautious and concentrated on enjoying my meals. As I wrapped up my tasks, the night had fully settled in, enveloping the surroundings in darkness. A warm campfire flickered beside me, casting a cozy glow as I immersed myself in a book on my Kindle. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind my store, roughly 10 meters away. As I navigated the woods, each deliberate step on the crunching leaves echoed with purpose. Though I may have been a servant, the rhythm of my movements carried an unmistakable intention. I shouted hello and directed my flashlight toward that spot. Yet, the ace illuminated nothing but barren trees and shrubs. The moment I called out, the footsteps ceased entirely. I remained perfectly still for about 10 minutes, simply absorbing the silence around me. I decided it must have been an animal and went back to my reading, but I couldn't focus on the words anymore. Around 99:30 at night, I decided to go to sleep. I made sure to put out the fire. Well, I hung up my bag of food. Bear safety is a habit etched in me, and I went into my tent. I always leave my boots, my headlamp and my knife right next to my sleeping bag, another habit acquired after years of camping. I just fell asleep pretty quickly despite the nagging feeling of restlessness. I woke up around 2 a.m. feeling like peeing. This is always the worst thing about camping, having to get out of your warm sleeping bag in the middle of the night. Grabbed my headlamp and opened the tent as quietly as possible. The moon was almost full, so even before I turned on the light I could see something wasn't right. My chair camping that I had left by the campfire was now placed directly in front of my tent about 3 meters away. I'm absolutely sure it wasn't there when I lay down. I felt my heart race. It shone the flashlight around the campground, expecting to see someone in the shadows, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I thought about just peeing next to my tent, but I was too worried about doing it. Ignoring the noise, I slipped on my boots and took hold of my knife, uncertain of its usefulness against an adversary who was likely already gone. I made my way swiftly to my usual spot, roughly 12 meters from camp. Upon my return, I observed something intriguing. My cooking equipment, which I had left neatly stacked on the picnic table, was now arranged in a perfect circle. It wasn't just scattered randomly. It was deliberately positioned in a precise pattern. At the heart of my setup was the pot, surrounded by my cup, spoon, and various utensils, all arranged like the spokes of a wheel. I lingered there for what felt like an endless moment, my flashlight's beam locked onto that peculiar display. Though I was certain I had gathered all my belongings and made my way back to the car, an inexplicable force held me in place. Perhaps it was the jolt of surprise or the dread that the perpetrator might still be nearby. I made my way back to my tent, pausing on the road that connects my spot to the parking lot. I nestled into the sleeping bag, pulling it snugly up to my chin. In one hand, I gripped a knife, while the other clutched my phone, desperately searching for a signal that just wouldn't come. Naturally, my greatest accomplishment was securing a spot at a bar close to the parking lot. I kept my flashlight illuminated, reassuring myself that if anyone were outside, they couldn't draw near without casting a shadow on the tent wall. The footsteps resumed, but this time they were different, steady and deliberate, encircling my tent at a measured distance of about 5 meters. If I had to guess, I could hear them crushing dry leaves, breaking the odd branch. They made no attempt to be silent. In fact, it gave the impression that they wanted me to listen to them. I began to count the laps they made around my tent. 1, 2, 3. Each circuit took about 2 minutes to complete. On the fourth lap, the steps stopped straight behind my tent. I held my breath, trying to listen for any sound that would tell me what they were doing. Then something scraped against the fabric of my tent. It wasn't claws or anything sharp. It felt more like a hand slowly sliding across the fabric from the height of my head to the ground. I think I did some kind of involuntary noise because the touch stopped immediately. The footsteps quickly moved away into the woods. I lay there for what seemed like an eternity, squeezing my knife until my hand cramped, listening to every little sound and imagining the worst. Finally, sheer exhaustion must have overcome me because I fell asleep. When I woke up, the morning light filtered through my tent. For a moment I thought that maybe I had dreamed it all up then. I opened the door of the store and saw what they had done while I was sleeping. All the objects I had left outside, my chair, my cooking equipment, even the pile of firewood, had been arranged in a huge spiral pattern around my tent. But the worst, the one that made me throw everything in my backpack and practically run to my car, was what they did with my boots. Somehow managed to get my boots out of the tent while I was sleeping, and I'm a light sleeper, especially after what had happened before. They had been placed in the exact center of the spiral, right in front of my tent door, lined up perfectly with a barely an inch of space between them. I didn't even bother to roll up my tent properly. I just ripped out the stakes, put it in its bag, and walked away from there. On the way out, I walked past a ranger who was coming in for his morning shift. I thought I'd stop to tell him what had happened, but what was I going to tell him? Someone moved my stuff in creepy patterns. I had no evidence that anything really threatening had happened. That was weeks ago. I haven't camped since, and I'm not sure when or if I'll do it again. I won't quit to think about those steps, about that deliberate touch on my tent, and most of all, how they managed to get my boots out without waking me up. I'm an experienced camper. I know most of the rational explanations for weird things you might find in the woods. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a raccoon. I want it was some prankster trying to scare me. This felt intentional, organized, as if whatever was there was trying to communicate with me. Something strangest of all. When I got home and unpacked, I found something inside one of my boots, a maple leaf folded perfectly in half, then in halves again to form a small triangle. It wasn't wrinkled or damaged. Each fold was precise, deliberate like an origami. I still have it pressed between the pages of my camp journal. Occasionally, I take it out and examine it, attempting to convince myself that there's a logical explanation for everything that transpired that night. Yet, deep down, I know there isn't. I've camped in very remote places over the years, but I had never felt unsafe until that night in Maple Creek. Outside of my presence, he wasn't just trying to scare me. He was trying to communicate something. I wish I knew what it was. I still get chills when I reflect on what happened to me last February. I've been trying to make sense of it for months, but I just can't. I drive a lot for work as a medical equipment sales rep, covering 3 states in the Midwest. I usually plan my stops ahead of time, but that night was different. My last meeting lasted much longer than expected, and by 9 p.m., I was still on the road. I was still 4 hours from home, struggling to stay awake on a dark stretch of Highway 71. Snow had begun to fall hard, and the forecast indicated that it would get worse. I knew I had to stop somewhere. Anywhere, actually. Almost stepped past the Mountain Pass Motel sign, barely visible with its faint flashing neon light that cast a reddish glow on the snow. The parking lot was empty, save for an old rusty pickup truck that I assumed belonged to the staff. The place looked run down, but not completely dilapidated, that kind of roadside motel that has seen better days, but still keeps the lights on for travelers like me. The office was old cigarettes and Apicute-scented cleaner behind the desk. An older man, probably in his 60s, reading a book of yellowed pages. He didn't even look up when I walked in. He just held up a finger asking me to wait while he finished his page. The clock on the wall read 9:47 at night. I need a room, I said, trying to sound more awake than I really was alone for. Tonight he put the book down slowly and started typing on an old computer. The sound of the keyboard felt abnormally loud in the quiet office. Simple or double single? Okay, I replied, pulling out my wallet. How much does it cost? $65 exactly. Departure at 11 o'clock. His voice was rough, as if I hadn't used it long. While processing my card, I noticed the board with keys behind him. They were all in place except one. The one he had taken for me. Room 114. Quiet night. I tried to make conversation. He just growled and slid the key across the counter. A real metal key with a blue plastic label. Numbers of those electronics at the end of the building. To lair. The vending machines are in the center. The office closes at 10, opens at 6. I went out, picked up my suitcase from the car, and I walked to my room. The snow was falling more intensely, now covering my tracks in a matter of seconds. The lock was a bit hard, but the room itself was decent. Just the basics: a bed queen, an old TV, and a small bathroom. The heater took a few minutes to turn on, vibrating as if I was waking up from a long sleep. I did my usual routine: quick shower, checked my emails, called my girlfriend to let her know, where the signal was weak, but I managed to communicate, "Yes, I'm fine. Just tired. It's a small motel on Highway 71. I'll leave early, tomorrow by 11 p.m. I was already in bed watching reruns of an old comedy, and it was then, when I noticed how quiet the place was. Absolute silence, no cars on the road, no footsteps of other guests, no doors closing, only an absolute emptiness, except for the occasional hum of the heater. I must have fallen asleep because the first knock woke me up suddenly. 3 sharp knocks on the door. The TV was still on, the room with a blue glow. The clock, it was 2:17 in the morning. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. Silence. I sat on the bed wide awake. Now another knock. Tap tap. I approached the door, trying to look through the peephole, but the outside was too dark. "Who is it?" I asked, this time louder. Nothing. And then the doorknob began to turn, not violently, but slowly and deliberately, as if someone was testing if the door was open. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. The doorknob stopped, then turned again, more insistently. This time, with trembling hands, I dialed the reception number that was taped next to the room phone. It rang 7 times before anyone answered. Reception was the same raspy voice of the receptionist. "I'm from room 114. Someone is at my door trying to enter." A long pause. "That's not possible, sir. Your tone," it was flat. "You're our only guest tonight." My mouth went dry. "What?" "But I can hear it. They're turning the doorknob at this moment." Another pause. "Sir, I assure you that you're the only person registered. I'm looking at the book right now," as if I wanted to prove myself wrong. 3 more knocks echoed on the door, louder. "This time you heard that." I practically screamed into the phone. The receptionist was silent for a moment. "I didn't hear anything, sir." But his tone was different now, almost expectantly. "He wants me to go check." "Yes, please now. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Those 5 minutes felt like hours. The banging had stopped, but now I could hear another sound, a smooth scraping like nails crawling through the door. I was frozen in the middle of the room with the phone in one hand and the key in the other, ready to run away. Yes, it was necessary. The scraping stopped. I heard footsteps on the snow. Then a flash of light passed through my window. Someone knocked on the door differently. This time firmer. "Reception," the raspy voice said. I looked through the peephole. First it was him, with a face of annoyance, and the flashlight still lit. I opened the door, just enough to see him well. "There's no one here, sir," he said, sweeping the flashlight down the empty hallway. "And look." He pointed to the snow outside. There were no footprints on the ground, just his freshly made and mine from when he had arrived hours before, but nothing else. But I stopped. How was I going to explain it, if there was no proof? The receptionist looked at me with a neutral expression. "It was probably just the wind," he said calmly. "These old buildings make a lot of noise," said this. He turned around and started walking back to the front desk. His footsteps creaked in the fresh snow, but only his. I closed the door and locked the lock, then dragged the only chair in the room and locked it under the doorknob. I didn't care how ridiculous it looked. I wasn't going to sleep. After that I sat on the bed, back against the headboard, staring at the door at 3:3:42 in the morning. The knocks came back, tap tap, but this time something else happened. The TV changed to static, filling the room with a deafening white noise. I tried to turn it off with the remote control. Nothing. I went straight to the power button. Nothing. The noise got louder, like a distorted roar, and then the images in the static changed. I know what this sounds like, but I swear, there were figures moving on the screen. Shadows passing from side to side as if they were behind frosted glass, and the noise was no longer just static. It was whispers, whispers I couldn't understand, but I felt too close. The cold in the room fell so hard that I could see my own breath. The heat was still on, but the air was icy. My hands were shaking, so much so that I could barely hold the phone to try to call the front desk again. This time no one answered the knocks on the door. They got louder. The handle started to spin violently. The noise of the static intensified until I thought it would break my ears. The TV flickered, and something new appeared on the screen. A motel hallway. This motel, the picture was grainy like old security tape, but I could clearly see the door to room 114. My door. The hallway was empty at first. And then something moved in the corner of the screen. A figure too tall, too thin, began to slowly approach the door of the room on the screen to my door. Every step I took in the picture, the knock on the actual door was getting stronger. My lungs couldn't take in air. Then, just as the figure on the screen was about to knock on the door, the TV went off. The knocking also stopped, and the temperature returned to normal in an instant. I stood there without moving, with my eyes fixed on the door until the sun or peeking out the window. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just waited for 6:15 in the morning when the sky was already clear. I gathered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty. The snow outside was still intact. There were no footprints except for me and the receptionists from the night before. But the worst, the office was closed when I went to the front desk to do a young woman. She was behind the counter just starting her shift. "Good morning," she said kindly, ready to leave. I nodded and unlocked the key on the counter with shaky hands. Then I tried not to sound crazy. When I asked, "The receptionist last night is still here?" The woman frowned. "The receptionist?" "Yes, the older man, raspy voice, gray hair." Her expression became even more confused. "Sir, we don't have a night receptionist." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could I not talk to him? I told him that someone was knocking on my door. He even came to check. The woman shook her head. "The office closes at 10. It has always been like this." I looked at her, expecting her to say it was a joke, but her expression did not change. I left immediately. But more, I didn't find any records on maps or reservation sites, as if it had never existed since. I've passed that stretch of highway several times during the day. I always look for that neon sign, but it's gone. There's nothing there. Just an empty expanse of overgrown road. I still travel for work, but now I plan my stays with a lot of more careful, only chain hotels, preferably full of people, and in every room I sleep in I always check the TV before I go to bed. If it turns on by itself, I won't stay to see what it shows. It still gives me chills to think about what happened to me last month in Vivue Mall. I've been involved in urban exploration photography for a few years, documenting abandoned buildings in my city. Usually the scariest thing I find are unstable floors or some stray raccoon. But what happened that day, I'm still trying to process it. I had heard that Valley View had been completely abandoned since 2019. It was a huge shopping mall from the 80s that was slowly decaying as more modern ones opened in the area. I had seen incredible photos on the internet of the empty aisles and dilapidated stores, so I thought it would be a perfect location for a solo session on my day off. I arrived at the dilapidated parking lot around 2 p.m., making sure from having plenty of natural light. The outside was just as I expected. Faded signs, broken windows, graffiti everywhere. I found an unlocked service entrance near the old food court and slid me in with my gear the first hour. The experience was remarkable. The quietude felt both disconcerting and serene. Sunlight poured through the skylights, casting stunning shadows across the vacant hallways. I captured breathtaking images of the parched fountains and the forsaken mannequins displayed in the shop windows. The decay of the place was both terrifying and beautiful. I was setting up a shot of the old carousel in the central plaza when I heard voices, human voices echoing through the empty corridors. My heart raced. Security guards? There shouldn't be any in an abandoned place. I quickly grabbed my tripod, ready to defend myself if needed. That's when I spotted them, a small group of people emerging from what used to be a department store. 5 of them, looking unkempt and dressed in worn-out clothes. I assumed they were homeless, living in the mall. The oldest man in the group, probably in his 50s with a scruffy gray beard, noticed me first. "Hey, photographer," he called in an overly friendly tone. "Don't be scared, we're the current tenants." I froze, unsure whether to run or try to explain my presence. I was present, yet everyone appeared so ordinary and welcoming. The older man, introducing himself as Mike, shared that he and his companions had been residing at the mall for the past 8 months. Their manner of speaking was unsettling, overly candid and excessively warm. "You won't believe how we've perfected the art of the old mice," said a younger woman named Sarah. "We've created an inviting atmosphere. Your camera is sure to capture its beauty," another added. "It may come across as innocent." At that moment, they instilled a sense of confidence in me. I had never witnessed how people truly lived in these forsaken locations. The presence of women in the group also added to my feeling of safety. Upon entering their home nestled within the old mice, I was immediately struck by its charm. They had ingeniously converted the store into a cozy living space, utilizing vintage shelves as room dividers and repurposed furniture to carve out intimate personal nooks. To top it off, they even had a kitchen, adding to the warmth of the atmosphere. As I sat there with the portable camping stoves, Mike offered me a sealed bottle of water, and I accepted it. They inquired about my photography, their interest seeming genuine, yet an unsettling feeling crept in. I noticed how Mike always positioned himself between me and the exits. Every time I mentioned needing to leave, they swiftly changed the subject. "You haven't seen the best yet," Mike said, his smile unnaturally wide. "Just wait until sunset." The tone of his voice sent chills down my spine. I began to observe more details, the way they exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking, their smiles failing to reach their eyes, the complete lack of personal belongings, no phone, no bag ready for a quick exit if needed. And the worst part? The scratch marks on some of the support columns and the dark stains on the carpet were too much to ignore. Large and scattered to just make damp a room with new locks, even though they were supposedly squatters. Mike must have noticed that he was watching too much. His expression changed slightly. The kindness was still there, but now it seemed forced. "You know, it's not safe leave here so late," he said in a tone too casual. "Some dangerous people come around here at night." The way he said it was a warning, or maybe a threat. My instinct screamed that I should get out of there. "You're probably right," I replied with a fake smile, "but first I need to go to the bathroom." Sarah got up immediately. "I can accompany you." "Oh no, I'm not well," I said with a nervous laugh. "I'm kind of shy about those things. Just give me a minute." They took me to what used to be the employee bathroom. They closed the door behind me. The ant tightly didn't have time to doubt the bathroom window was small, but maybe enough for it to happen. The problem was that it was on the second floor outside. I could hear them talking. Quietly, I knew I only had a few minutes before they realized something wasn't right. I tried to break the window with my camera bag, but it made too much noise. I had no choice. I wrapped my jacket around my arm and I hit the glass once, 2, 3 times. The glass shattered. "All right there," Mike screamed from outside. I tried to sound normal. Yes, I just threw the paper towel dispenser, pushed my bag out the window and threw myself behind it, fell on the roof of a lower structure. The impact made me see stars, but fear kept me moving behind me. The screams started. You knew. I ran. I went through the roof until I found an emergency ladder. I ran down it. I scraped Las Palmas, but I didn't care. I ran to my car faster than I had ever run in my life. When I started, I saw them leave the mall. Mike was in front of it. He was no longer smiling. He just stared at me as I drove away. I drove non-stop until I got home. When I finally felt safe, I called the police and told them what had happened. I gave them the exact address of the mall and described what I had seen. But when they checked the place the next day, they found nothing. No sign of makeshift campsites, no camping stoves, no rearranged furniture, no trace of Mike, Sarah, or the others. Just an empty mall in ruins. But I know what I saw. I know I didn't imagine the scratch marks on the walls. I know I didn't imagine the dark stains on the carpet. And the most disturbing thing is that I've been back to that place a couple of times. Since then, always during the day, always from a safe distance, and sometimes, if I look at the right angle through the broken skylights, I swear I see movement inside, figures walking through the empty aisles, as if they were shopping in a store that closed years ago. I still have my camera and all the photos I took that day. Well, almost all of them, because somehow the images I took inside the mice disappeared. I didn't delete them. I didn't lose them. They're just gone. But maybe that's the best. I don't need any more memories of what I saw there or what might have happened to me if I hadn't escaped in time. Since that day, I quit urban exploration. These days, I focus on capturing the beauty of nature in the woods. When danger approaches, you can spot it from afar. Working in a toll booth at night reveals some amusing patterns that you can't help but notice. Truck drivers often experience delays when it comes to receiving their change. Evening travelers. You're hardly paying attention to yourself, yearning to return home. Yet, that night, when those headlights illuminated my window at 1 a.m., I sensed something was amiss. I was only half awake in the morning. My chair with the radio playing softly in the background, the sound of an engine approaching made me straighten my hands, automatically moving towards the cash register. But the car didn't approach my window as usual. It stopped about 6 meters behind with the headlights on, pointing directly at me. At first I thought they were looking for change or checking their phone. Sometimes people notice at the last second of that needs cash, but a minute passed. Then 2. The engine was still running, but no one got out of the car. No window was lowered. Only those headlights flooding my small glass box with a cold white light. I tried to see through the windshield, but the glare prevented me from doing so. The only thing I could make out was a dark silhouette behind the steering wheel, completely motionless. My hand floated over the security radio. "We're supposed to report any suspicious thing," but I doubted what I'd say. A car was stopped there, he'd make fun of me. I stuck my head out the window and waved my hand. "Hey, you can move to the cab." My voice sounded weak in the night air. The car didn't move. The silhouette didn't react, just kept looking. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The palms of my hands began to sweat. Every horror story I'd heard about workers' toll starts to seep into my mind. We're ducks sitting here trapped in these little white glass boxes. Perfect. I checked my phone with no signal. It was always like this on this part of the road. The radio started to seemed like a more reasonable option, but before I could reach it, the headlights went out. The sudden darkness was Kedora blinking several times, trying to adjust my vision. Only the sound of the engine filled the silence. Then I heard the car door open. My heart shot. I leaned forward, trying to see better. A tall figure got out of the car, but instead of approaching the cockpit, he leaned against his car, just standing there watching me. "He needs help," I asked, my voice betraying my nervousness. There was no answer, only that dark silhouette in the half-light. With my arms crossed, the air felt heavy. Something was wrong, very wrong. The minutes were dragged as if time had stopped. My breathing became shallow. Every part of my body screamed at me that something wasn't right. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was slow, deliberate, like he'd been planning it all along. Like he wanted me to know that he was in control. That he could stay there all night if he wanted to. That he knew I was trapped. My hand closed around the radio. I didn't care to look like paranoid, but just as my fingers pressed the button, I heard precise, slow footsteps moving around the cockpit. It came out of my line of sight. My skin stood on end. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could hear it walking around me like a predator measuring its prey. The footsteps stopped just outside the cockpit door. My hand was shaking over the radio. It didn't try to open the door. It didn't try to force its way in. But it didn't try to get in. I felt there just across the glass, waiting. The cabin was safe. The doors were closed, but that didn't matter. He knew I was trapped. The silence was suffocating. The sound of my breathing and the hum of the lights were the only thing that broke the stillness. Then the footsteps started again, moving away. This time he got back in his car. He climbed in slowly, without rushing, like he knew he had all the world time. The engine roared but didn't move to my window. Instead, the car slowly passed by the cab, stopped just a few feet ahead, just enough for me to see him clearly. He kept smiling, more ample, now more confident, as if he was saying he could have gone in if he wanted to. He could come back whenever he wanted. I stood motionless, staring as he slowly walked away into the darkness. When my shift ended at dawn, I could barely speak. I just packed my things and left without saying a word. I quit that same day without 2 weeks' notice. No explanations. I couldn't risk another night in that glass box waiting if he would come back. Now I work in an office during the day. No lonely nights, no isolated booths. But sometimes when I drive at night and pass by a toll booth, I can't help but remember that smile in my rearview mirror, and I wonder he's out there still waiting in the dark, playing his game with someone else. The worst thing is that I never saw his face with clarity. I could never see his car. Well, be anyone. Sometimes when I stop at a traffic light and the headlights flood my mirrors, I find myself checking just for a second, looking to see if someone is watching me with that same calculating smile, because that's what it's the terror. Not the moment itself, but how it stays with you, how it changes the way you see the world. Because now I know that sometimes the real horror isn't in what happens to you, it's in what almost happens to you, in the waiting, in the not knowing, and in the fear that maybe, just maybe, he's still out there watching, waiting, smiling. I need to share what happened during my night shift at the veterinary clinic last month. I have worked with animals for over 6 years, and I had never experienced anything like this. It still gives me chills to remember that night. I was on call at a small veterinary clinic on the outskirts of town. Was a basic place, a few exam rooms, an operating theater, and a cage area in the back for animals that stayed in the observation. During the night shifts, it was just me with the animals that were in recovery or waiting to be discharged. The clinic was quite isolated. There was only one gas station across the street, and it closed at 11 p.m. The night started like any other. I had 3 dogs and 2 cats staying that night, all routine cases around the median. I was doing paperwork when the phone rang. In night shifts you get used to getting emergency calls, usually from panicked owners because their pet vomited or has diarrhea, but this call was different. When I answered there was a strange silence, then heavy breathing. I was about to hang up thinking it was a joke, but then a male voice spoke. Sounded agitated. He said his dog was bleeding a lot and needed help immediately. I went into professional mode. I asked him about the symptoms and I gave him directions to the clinic. It was then that something felt off. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it. He described the blood in too much detail with a precision that seemed more enjoyed than worried. Then suddenly hung up. I thought maybe he would take the dog to the emergency vet hospital in the city, or that it wasn't as serious as he made it seem. But minutes later he called again. This time he was talking about a cat with a broken leg. He used the same tone, the same way of describing wounds, only now he was talking about a cat instead of a dog. I gave him the same directions, but it seemed that he wasn't listening. He just kept describing the injury with an unsettling fascination. The calls went on, one every half each time. It was a different animal with a different wound, but always in that strangely enthusiastic way. Described the pain and never brought any animals. I just called, talked, hung up at 2 in the morning, called again, but this time her tone changed. I can see you sitting at the desk. I froze. That blue blouse, it looks good that night. I was wearing a blue blouse, but the clinic was dark, except for the dim light on my desk. The blinds were closed. There was no way she could see me. I got up and I checked all the doors, making sure they were locked. I looked out the front window but saw nothing, even though the parking lot lights were off, which was weird because they had to be on all night. The phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but we're not allowed to ignore calls in case of real emergencies. When I did, his voice rang even closer. You got up to check the doors. I felt a chill run through me. The back knew exactly what I had done just a minute ago. I hung up and called the police. While talking to the operator, I heard a knock on the back door. It was the employee entrance. No one except the clinic workers knew about that door. The knocks got louder, then suddenly they stopped. The phone rang again. You don't have to call the police, his voice said. I just want to help. Let me in and I'll show you this time. His voice was different, harder, more furious. In the background of the call, I heard what sounded like animals moaning in pain. But something about those sounds was wrong. They didn't sound real. I ran to the cage area to check on the animals I had in the clinic. They were all restless. The dogs were barking and growling towards the back door. The cats were bristling, snorting. The police said they would send a patrol car, but it would take about 15 minutes. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life. The phone kept ringing. When I didn't answer, he left me voicemails. Each one was the same. Sounds of animals suffering, their breathing, and that low, almost mechanical laugh between calls. I heard him walking around the building, trying different doors, knocking on windows, and then he was silent for a moment. I thought about he had left, but then I heard his voice. Not on the phone this time, but outside the window of the exam room. I know what animals you have with you. My stomach churned. I know their names, their breeds, because they are here. He began to name them, not only their species, but their real names, their reasons for admission, details that were only in the clinic system or written on their cages, the way that I could have known if he had been inside before. Finally the police arrived, but by the time they checked the place he had already left, they found strange marks on the back door. They looked like scratches, as if someone had tried to pick the lock with something sharp. The security cameras had been running all night, but when reviewing the recording they only showed static from midnight. The most disturbing part was when they checked the phone records, there were no incoming calls during that period, nothing, like they had never existed. But I still had the messages on my voicemail, the sounds of animals agonizing, their breathing, their voice telling me they could see me. I quit that same night. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone in that place again. I now work in a vet's office by day where there are always more people around, but sometimes my phone rings in the room. In the early morning hours, I pick up the phone only to be met with heavy breathing and the eerie sounds of animals that seem almost otherworldly. The police were unable to track him down. They remained oblivious to how I possessed such extensive knowledge about the clinic, the animals, or my own activities. Following that incident, the clinic enhanced its security measures and brought on 2 additional staff members for the night shift. Yet, each time I walk by, I can't help but wonder if he's still lurking nearby, ready to target someone else. This may seem unbelievable. Had someone shared this with me prior to my experience, I would have dismissed it outright. Yet, I am certain of what I heard during those calls, and I am convinced that someone was observing me that night. someone who possessed an unsettling amount of knowledge and still does. It began with a simple paper cut, or so he claimed. Yet, paper cuts rarely warrant a trip to the emergency room at 3 a.m., and they certainly don't draw someone back night after night, their gaze unwavering and unblinking. For nearly 2 years, I dedicated my nights to the bustling emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital as a nurse. I had witnessed it all: inebriated, anxious teenagers, and those suffering from serious illnesses and injuries. You cultivate an intuitive understanding of your patients. You become adept at interpreting the nuanced cues that reveal whether someone is genuinely in pain or simply in need of companionship. Seek attention. Derek was different from the start. He arrived one night, calm Tuesday, holding his arm strangely against his chest. He was tall, maybe a 3-something, with an intense look that made me uncomfortable even before he spoke. The cut was superficial, it barely deserved a band-aid. But he insisted that it be checked out, it might be infected, he said without taking his eyes off my face as he cleaned the wound. I've been watching him carefully. Something in the way he said watching made my skin stand on end. I finished bandaging quickly, maintaining my professional demeanor despite how close he leaned while working. You have soft hands, he muttered as he secured the gauze, very precise. I like that. I smiled at him politely and I took a step back, creating distance between us. He's ready. Keep it clean and dry and he'll be fine. He didn't move to leave. He just stood there staring with those eyes, no blinking. You'll be here tomorrow night. My stomach tightened. Sir, you won't need to go back, for this is a minor cut. His smile didn't reach his eyes. You never know. Things can get so bad the next night. He came back, this time with a small bruise on his forehead. I fell, he explained, although the mark looked more like someone had pressed his thumb to the skin. I wanted to make sure that I called Dr. Matthew to examine him. I didn't want to be alone in the room with him again. While the doctor checked his pupils, Derek's eyes remained fixed on me, standing in the door. Everything seems fine, he concluded. The doctor, no signs of commotion, you're sure? Derek asked with a barely perceptible smile. Maybe I should stay under observation. Emma could watch me. My heart stopped. I hadn't told him my name. My badge was on the opposite side as I used to on night shifts. The encounters continued each night with a new minor injury that any normal person would have treated at home. A scraped knee, a bruised finger, another small cut on the hand. Each time it stayed longer. Every time he talked more, he looked at me more and more intensely. You look tired tonight, Emma said on a visit. Those shifts at night, they must be hard. His voice was soft, almost comforting. But I like to see you here. It's quiet. Just you and I in the early morning. I started to dread my shifts. I knew he could show up at any time. I varied my rest schedules. I took different routes inside the hospital. I asked other nurses to attend to him when he arrived. But I always found myself. I always knew exactly where he was. One night around 2 in the morning, I was too close not to have heard him approaching. You didn't work. You continued. I waited for you, but you never got there. My heart hammers. How did you get in here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. This area is for staff only. His smile widened. I watch you, Emma. I know all your routines, where you take your breaks. Which hallways do you prefer to walk through? I even know about that little coffee shop on C Street where you buy coffee before the shift. My blood froze. I had never mentioned that cafeteria to no one at work. Say, take a step back, you have to go. This area is restricted. I'm going to call security. They won't understand, she said, tilting her head like a confused child. No one understands what we have. There's no we. My voice trembled. You're just my patient. Nothing more. Her expression changed, darkened. Don't say that, she whispered. You're just scared. Everyone gets scared at first. I tried to turn around to walk away, but his hand caught my wrist. His grip was too tight. His eyes were too hungry. Let me go, I warned him. Although my voice was barely a murmur, his thumb caressed the skin of my arm as if trying to memorize it. I can't, he whispered. I need to see you. I need to observe you. I need a gray code. My scream broke the silence, sign of a violent patient. Immediately the security personnel appeared in the corner. Tarek let go of me just as they were approaching when they surrounded him. His face transformed into a mask of innocence. The bathroom, he said in a calm voice, raising his hands. The nurse was just giving me directions. They escorted him out, but I could feel him looking at me all the time. That night I filed a report, told my supervisor everything. They said they would ban him from the facility, that they would increase security in my area, that I would never be alone again on my shift. But that didn't stop him. He started showing up outside the hospital, standing across the street, watching. He saw him in the parking lot, under the lights of the lanterns, looking out of the ER windows. Sometimes he found notes in my car. You look beautiful in that blue sweater. Your cat looks only when you're not there. You should fix the flashing light on your porch. Every note was proof that he was watching me, that he knew me, that I'd been at my house. The police said they couldn't do much. I hadn't committed any crimes. I hadn't made any threats. I just watched. So I quit. I moved to another city. I changed my name. I started again. But sometimes in a crowd or on a busy street, I see eyes fixed on me. Eyes that never blink, and I know it's still there. Still watching, learning, still waiting, because that's what I do. He observes, he absorbs, and he never ceases to explore. Radio waves traverse the darkness in ways that light cannot. They bounce off buildings, slip through walls, and carry voices to unexpected places. Yet, the voice that initiated my program, Nocto, didn't travel through any familiar frequency. It emanated from a much nearer source. It had been 3 years since the midnight shift announcer at WKRX, a small station, just a blip on the radio dial map, had built a loyal following of insomniacs, truck drivers, and night shift workers seeking companionship in the late hours. Most nights, he received 2 or 3 calls. Song requests, casual chats, nothing out of the ordinary. That was until he began to call, the first time around 1 o'clock. The morning I had just finished a block of classic rock and was about to start the next batch of songs when the light on the phone flashed. I didn't think much of it. Just another night call. WX, you're on the air with Jack. What can I play for you tonight? Long enough to feel uncomfortable, then a quiet, low voice with a strange echo that I assumed was the fault of the phone line. You seem tired tonight, Jack. My heart stopped for a moment. The station booth was on the 3rd floor of an empty office building. There were no windows facing the street, and the only way to see me was from inside the building. Sorry, I asked, trying to keep my voice relaxed. Those energy drinks aren't helping you much, right? I see 3 empty cans on your desk. My gaze slid to the Red Bull cans lined up next to my cup of coffee. My chest tightened. Who are you? How do you know that? The line was cut. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. There was no way anyone could see me. The building was closed after 10 p.m. I was the only one with access to this floor. I told myself it must have been a coincidence. Many announcers, night drinkers, consume energy drinks. Maybe it was just a good fortune teller. But he called again the next night. That blue shirt fits you well, highlights the color of your eyes. I was wearing a blue shirt. It couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow this person could see me despite the walls, despite the locked doors. Listen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know how you're doing this, but you need stop you. There was a silence. Then the voice answered, why would I like to see you work? I like the way you move to the beat of the music. When you think no one is watching, the way you talk just between songs, the way you keep looking over your shoulder like you feel like I'm here. Click. I called security. They checked the building. They didn't find anything. The security cameras didn't show any movement. But the calls went on every night, not always around the same time, each time with more details about my life. That sandwich you had for lunch didn't seem very fresh. You should check the expiration dates at the corner store. Your car is almost out of gas. You should fill up the tank before you go home. You really should. Call your mother back. She's worried about you. It was like she was watching me in at all times, not just in the booth, in my entire life. That night after the call, I decided to search the studio. I went through every corner. I moved every piece of equipment looking for a hidden camera, a microphone, something. Then I saw it in a corner of the room. There was a small space between the acoustic panels, a barely visible gap shining the flashlight. Inside I saw an old maintenance duct running through the entire building, a labyrinth of wires and pipes, a place where someone could be hiding. Something moved inside. I pulled back, my heart hitting against my ribs. The phone rang with my hand shaking. I picked it up. You found it. The voice was no longer coming from the phone. It came from the conduit. Where are you? I asked in a whisper. Everywhere. I felt a chill coming up my back. What do you want? There was a long silence. Then the voice whispered, I want to share. I want to show you what I've learned. I want you to see how I see. The lights flicker. The studio was left in the dim dark red light of emergency. I saw him, a tall and thin figure hidden in the darkness of the conduit, his face covered with psalm, but his eyes shone, reflected the red light like those of a cat. Took a step forward. Beautiful truth, whispered, this little world that you have built, your music, your voice, your life. My back hit the wall. What do you want from me? I want you to see. I want you to learn. I want you to understand what it Means to observe. I closed my eyes. I prayed it was a hallucination. When I opened them again, he was gone. The lights came back on. The phone was at its base. The booth was silent. I left the station that same night. I never came back. I didn't pick up my things. I just left. I found another job in another city by day where nothing can hide in the dark, but sometimes when I turn on the radio I hear his voice, not saying words, just breathing. Waiting because I know it's still there. Keep watching. Keep learning. Because that's what it does. Observe, learn, understand. And somewhere between the walls of that old building, it's still there, still waiting for someone new to study. The security cameras don't show everything. That's the first lesson in mall security training. There's always blind spots, dead zones where anything could happen without being recorded. But what that the cameras caught that night in the food court, sometimes I wish they hadn't caught anything at all. I had worked security at Riverwood Mall for about 2 years. The night shift wasn't exactly exciting. Just walking around checking doors, making sure no one broke in after the mall closed. It was one of those nostalgic days, featuring 3 tiers of shops encircling a vibrant food court and expansive corridors. That seemed to stretch forever in the dim emergency light. Most nights were quiet. Sometimes teenagers tried to sneak in or homeless people sought shelter. But nothing serious. Over time, the emptiness of the place became almost peaceful. Just me, my flashlight, and the constant hum of the ventilation system. That night began like any other. I made my 2 o'clock in the morning round, walking through the dark courtyard of when I saw her. A woman was standing near the bastard. Just watching. She was wearing a dark dress that absorbed the little light of the place, and her hair fell long and straight down her back. Protocol said that I should approach and ask her to leave. The mall had closed hours ago, but something about the way she was standing completely motionless made me doubt. The air felt different, heavier somehow, like the moment before. It's a storm, ma'am, I called, trying to keep my voice professional. The mall is closed. It must be removed. She spun slowly, and I felt the blood run cold. Her face was strange somehow. It wasn't disfigured or monstrous, just wrong, as if someone had tried to remember what a face is supposed to look like, but had failed in the details. We're connected, she said in a soft voice, but that resonated clearly in the empty space. I've been watching you. Music. Started walking towards me. His movements were fluid but strange, as if I was watching a video played at a slightly incorrect speed. I walked away, finally managing to get the radio to my mouth. Control. I need reinforcements in the food court. Possible. Tengu 96. I only received static, white noise, and a faint whisper that could have been my name. The woman is more close now, still with that impossible smile. You're so interesting when you think you're alone, she said. The way you move as you observe how you exist in these empty spaces. I want to understand it all. I ran. Professional pride went to the every instinct in my body screamed that I should get away. My footsteps echoed on the walls as I ran towards the security office, but I could hear her behind me, moving with that same steady step, never rushing, but somehow always staying close. The security office was my sanctuary. Reinforced door, multiple cameras, direct line to the police. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then turned to the monitors to see where it was. The cameras showed nothing, just empty hallways and dark food court. But I could hear her walking somewhere in the darkness, approaching. I called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. They said they would send someone, but I could hear the skepticism in the dispatcher's voice. Just another security guard scared by the shadows. The monitors flickering, static covering the screens. When they cleared up, she was there right outside my door, looking directly into the camera. Her face was now clearer, and I finally understood that it was what bothered me so much. It wasn't just that it was wrong. It was my face, or something that was trying to be my face, stretched over features that weren't made to carry it. Let me in, she said. Her voice filtered both through the door and through my radio. Let me turn you on completely, I warned, even though my voice broke. The police are on their way, she laughed, a sound like glass breaking. They won't see me. They never do. Only you can see me, because now we're connected. The office lights started flashing, and the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The doorknob started to turn, even though I knew I had locked it. No one will believe you whispered. They'll think you imagined me. But you know I'm real. You know I chose you, and now you'll learn to watch me open. I don't remember much after that. The police found me hours later, huddled in a corner of the office. The security footage showed nothing, just me running empty, locking them in dark corridors, knowing she might be watching. But quitting work didn't do any good. Now I see her everywhere. In the crowds, in the reflections of the shop windows, in the mirrors, always with my face, always with that wrong smile, always watching to see. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at people the same way she looked at me, noticing every little detail of how they move, how they exist in space, and I wonder this is how it starts. This is how you learn to observe how she is still there, still open, still hiring night guards. But sometimes if you walk through the food court late at night, you might see a woman standing near the old bastard, and if she turns to look at you, you might notice that her face is still there. It feels recognizable, as if it's someone you've encountered before but just can't pinpoint. Be careful not to let her catch you watching, for once she becomes aware of your gaze, once she selects you, she becomes a constant presence. She simply guides you to observe, just as she did with me. The initial note appeared harmless, merely a scrap of torn paper resting atop a stack of boxes. Sweet dreams, Alex. Ordinary phrases that seemed insignificant, yet echoed in the stillness of an empty warehouse at 2 a.m. In the stillness of solitude, even the most innocent words can take on a menacing tone. For 2 months, I found myself immersed in the night shift at the warehouse. It wasn't a bad gig, just me and a couple of colleagues, Eddie and Mike, sorting through pets and prepping for the morning rush. I relished the routine. With my headphones on, I tuned out the world and let the hours slip by, free from the pressures of bosses or bothersome customers. The warehouse loomed large, its endless rows of metal shelves reaching up to the ceiling, stocked with everything from electronics to furniture. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting patches of brightness amidst the long shadows. Most nights, I worked alone in my section, which suited me perfectly. Eddie was stationed at the loading docks while Mike handled other tasks. From the inventory office, when I found the first note, I thought it was probably Eddie's joke, although it seemed strange to me. Eddie wasn't the joker type. He was a quiet guy who kept to his own thing. When I asked him later, he just shrugged his shoulders with a face of genuine confusion. "It wasn't me, brother," he said without looking up from his clipboard. "Maybe someone from the day shift left it there. I tried, I didn't know it." But something in the note didn't add up. It had been deliberately placed right where I would find it during my rounds, and my name Alex wasn't written anywhere. I wasn't even wearing a badge with my name on it. The next night another note appeared in the same place, this time with my full name, Alex Martin. My stomach flipped when I read it. 2 nights in a row. They couldn't be a coincidence, and now who left these notes knew my last name. Also from there I began to be more alert. I checked the corners before turning. I listened carefully in case I heard footsteps that were not mine. The warehouse felt different now, as if the shadows between the shelves had more depth, as if they could hide something or someone. The notes kept appearing. Sometimes they were simple, just my name or a phrase but then they became more personal. "How's your mom doing? After the surgery?" I froze when I read that one. I'd never told anyone at work about my mom's knee surgery. It wasn't something I would have mentioned in casual conversation. "Your brother liked his birthday present. That one left me cold. I'd sent a gift card to my brother just 2 days ago. I hadn't given it to him. As I told no one, you forgot to lock your apartment door this morning. That was the one that really scared me. Because it was true, in my rush to get to work on time, I had forgotten to lock the door. But as someone else knew, the implications made my skin crawl. I started documenting everything. I took pictures of the notes with my phone, wrote down where I found them and what time they always appeared when no one else was around. I tried to leave my phone recording while I worked, hoping to catch whoever left them, but the battery always died before I could capture anything useful. Something in the metal structure of the warehouse affected the signal and drained the charge faster than normal. One night I decided to stay in one place and keep an eye on the pallet where the notes used to appear. I turned off the forklift, turned off the lights in my section, and waited in the darkness. The hours passed. My legs cramped from standing, my eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. Then I heard its soft and deliberate footsteps moving in the darkness behind me. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding strangely faint in the silence of the warehouse. "There's someone there." The footsteps stopped the silence that had followed. It was absolute, dense, as if something was holding its breath next to me. I turned on my flashlight and swept the ace through the area. Nothing. Just rows of boxes and empty air. Turned to the pallet. There was a new note. "You shouldn't be here." My hands began to shake. I hadn't seen anyone approaching. I hadn't heard anything but those footsteps, but someone had been close enough to leave that note, close enough to touch me if he had wanted to. I started walking towards the loading area where Eddie used to work. I tried to keep a normal pace, but every cell in my body was screaming for me to run. The steps started again, following me slowly, measured, always at the same distance. "Eddie," I called, hoping it was just a very elaborate joke. "It's you." There was no response, just those footsteps following me like a shadow. When I got to the loading dock, burst into the room breathless. Eddie looked at me from his workstation, surprised. "You're okay, man?" he asked. "You seem to have seen a ghost." I turned to look behind me. Nothing. Only the dark hallway from which I had come out, completely empty. "Did you see someone pass through here?" I asked, trying to catch his breath. Eddie frowned. "Number, just you, running as if something was chasing you." I told him everything, the notes, the steps, the feeling of being watched. Eddie listened silently, expression becoming more and more serious. "We should check the security cameras," he said. Finally, we went to the security office, but when we tried to access the recordings, all the cameras in my section were showing static. Eddie clicked on different files and schedules. "Nothing. This is weird," muttered. "These cameras were working fine earlier. When I returned to my section, there was a new note waiting for me." "You think that they'll believe you? You think they can help you? That was the last night I worked at the warehouse. I quit immediately, handed in my badge, picked up my stuff, and left without waiting. My last paycheck wasn't worth anything. It was worth it feeling like I was being married. But quitting work didn't stop it. Notes followed me home. I found them everywhere, under my car's windshield wipers, sliding under my apartment door, even in my mailbox. Each one more personal than the last. "Your sister is getting married soon. You've already written your speech. The coffee shop you like on CCO Street is closing next week. You should change the light bulb in your room. The flickering is bad for the eyes." I went to the police. I took the notes. I tried to explain how someone was stalking me. They took a report. They promised to investigate. But I knew I didn't. They would after all. What crime had been committed? That someone left notes. That someone watched from afar. But that's the problem. With being watched, it changes you. It makes you question everything. Every stranger on the street could be him. Every car that passes by could contain those eyes that follow me. Every shadow could hide the person who knows too much about my life. I moved to another apartment. I changed my phone number. I got a new job, but the notes still find me less frequent now, but they're still there, reminding me that I never quite escaped. Yesterday, another one appeared. I found it nailed to my door. "You can't hide from me, Alex. I'm part of your life now, always watching, always knowing. Sweet dreams. I don't sleep much anymore. I can't relax. I can't let my guard down. 'Cause somewhere someone is watching me. Someone knows everything about me, follow every one of my movements, documents my life in these little notes that appear like clockwork. And the worst, I still don't know who it is. It could be anyone. A former coworker, a neighbor, a stranger who chose me at random. They could be looking at me right now, as I write this, planning their next note, deciding what detail of my life they will reveal next. Sometimes I think about going back to the warehouse, about facing whoever is behind this, but then I remember those steps in the dark, that feeling of being married, and I know I can't do it because deep down I'm afraid of what I might find. I'm afraid that knowing the truth is worse than not knowing, so I live with it. I've learned to check every room when I get home, to vary my routine, to always be aware of my surroundings. I've learned that privacy is an illusion, that there's always someone watching, always knowing, and sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if they're out there right now, writing their next note, planning their next message, wondering if they're smiling as they watch me from the dark, knowing they've changed my life forever. 'Cause that's what they've done. They've changed everything. Private now. It seems suspicious. Every moment of tranquility could be interrupted. Every personal detail could be within your next note, and somewhere in the shadows they're still watching, still knowing, still writing. I need to vent, because this has been tormenting me for weeks. I was working the night shift of a small print shop, you know, the kind that make business cards, flyers, and things like that. My job was to operate the print press from midnight to 8 in the morning. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened in the time I had been there until 3 weeks ago. I still can't explain what I experienced that night. The place was quite basic, a large room with 2 printing presses, some computers for design, and a warehouse in the back. During the night, there was only me, which didn't bother me. I liked to work. Only the sound of the press became white noise after a while, and I was just concentrating on my work. That night started like any other. I was processing a large order of business cards, making sure they all came out well. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something strange on one of the sheets coming out of the press. At first I thought it was a printing error or an ink stain. But when I looked closely, I saw that they were strange symbols mixed with the text. They looked like letters, but not any language I knew. I assumed the file was corrupted, so I stopped the press and went to check the computer, but when I opened the original file, it was perfectly normal, just business cards with ordinary text. I went back to check the printed sheets, and at that moment I felt a presence behind me, that feeling that someone is standing right behind you. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, just the empty room and the buzz of fluorescent lights, but I swear, I could feel someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it and go back to work. I turned on the press again, but now the strange symbols appeared on every sheet, and the worst thing was that they started forming words, English words. What really scared me was what they said. I know you hate Mondays. I know it sounds stupid, but here there's the detail. That afternoon I had been complaining about Mondays with a coworker. At lunch, there was no one else around. When we had that conversation, I stopped the press again, my hands shaking as I went through the sheets. More words appeared. The coffee here is terrible. Not just. Like you said last week, I had said it. I had been complaining about the coffee in the break room a few days ago, but only I didn't mention it to anyone myself at this point. I was really scared. I went to the warehouse to get more new paper, thinking maybe the batch I was using was faulty. The warehouse was dark, the light switch was all the way in, so I used my phone's flashlight. It was then that I saw the laptop. There was an old laptop on top of one of the paper boxes. It was turned on the screen. You could see lines of code or something like that, and as I looked at the same symbols that I had seen on the printouts, they started to appear on the screen. Then I heard the sound of the keyboard typing, but no one was touching the keyboard. I ran out of there and went back to the print room. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold my phone to try to call my supervisor. But before I could dial, the press started working. For yes, the paper fed, and on each sheet new words appeared. I've been watching you, learning how you work. You're so interesting. When you think you're alone. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't leave the press running like this. I'd waste thousands of sheets of paper and probably jam the machine, so I went over to turn it off, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing next to the computer, but something was wrong with him. It was very thin. He was wearing dark clothes and moved in a strange way, as if he was trying to imitate how a normal person is supposed to walk, but without quite succeeding. He looked at me and smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was like he had read about smiles in a book and was trying to make one. When he spoke, his voice sounded mechanical, as if he was imitating the way humans speak. Codes, they're beautiful, right? He said, I've been studying you, learning how it all works. I slowly backed up to the door, but he moved too fast. 1 second I was next to the computer, the next I was blocking my path closely. His face was even stranger. His eyes were too big and they weren't blinking. You don't have to be afraid, he continued. I just want to understand. I want to learn how you think. How do you exist in this space? I ran. I didn't care about the press or my job. I just ran to the exit as fast as I could. Behind me I could hear the press running at full speed, papers flying everywhere, and that typing sound coming from the laptop. When I got to my car, my hands were shaking so much that I could barely put the key in the ignition. I looked back at the building, and there I was standing at the window, smiling that wrong smile, watching me. I called my boss from the car and quit at that instant. I told him to send me my last check in the mail. I know he probably thinks I'm crazy or that I was high, but I know what I saw. The strangest thing is that I passed by a few days later during the day shift. Everything seemed normal, just employees working as if nothing had happened. It would have happened. But when I checked on the internet, I found that your computer system had a total failure that same night. All the files were corrupted with those same strange symbols, and all your backups were destroyed. Now I have a new job, working during the day in a copy shop, but sometimes when I'm operating the machines, I see strange symbols start to appear in the printouts. They disappear when I look closely, but I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm on my computer at home late at night, those same symbols flash on my screen for a split second. I don't know what that thing was, a hacker, a ghost, something else. I just know there was something in that building with me that night, something that had been watching me for who knows how long, and sometimes I feel like it still does. It still learns, it's still trying to understand how we humans work. I know how crazy this all sounds, but I know what I lived through, and I'll never work a night shift again. You never notice the empty spaces until something fills them. For weeks I barely paid attention to the big windows in front of our convenience store. They were just there, letting in the light during the day, reflecting the fluorescent glow at night. But then he showed up, and suddenly those windows, they became the only thing I could think of. The first time I saw it, I almost overlooked it. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was restocking the candy aisle with my back to the entrance. When I turned to take another box, I saw a slight movement through the glass. A man was standing there just outside the entrance, with his hands in his pockets, staring at the versus. At first I didn't give it much thought. Working the night shift, you see, everything, drunk, sleepless students, truck drivers looking for coffee, but this guy didn't go in. He just stood there, perfectly motionless, as if he was waiting for something. After about 10 minutes I started to feel restless. He hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't checked his tello or done any of the normal things people do when waiting. I just watched. I was concentrating on my work, but I kept looking at it out of the corner of my eye, checking if it was still there. It was always there around 3 in the morning. Finally it left without a dramatic movement, without a goodbye. It just turned and got lost in the darkness. It exhaled a breath. I hadn't realized that I was holding back, and I tried to shake off the strange feeling it had left me. But the next night it came back, same time, same place, unsettling immobility. This time I could see him better. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a worn jacket that hung loosely over his shoulders. But his face was what worried me the most. There was something empty about him, as if he was wearing a mask that didn't fit him at all. I thought about call my manager, but what was I going to tell him? A man is standing outside the room. I wasn't breaking any rules. I was simply there, observing night after night, consistently at 2 a.m. Always in the same spot. I found myself lingering for varying lengths of time, sometimes an hour, sometimes more. To dodge his visits, I began scheduling my breaks, retreating to the back room until I believed he had left. Yet, he seemed to sense my avoidance. He lingered longer on those nights, waiting for me. After 2 weeks, I reached my breaking point. I approached the door, my heart racing so fiercely I could feel it in my throat. I steeled myself to sound composed. "Excuse me," I said through the glass. "I can help you with something." He didn't respond right away. His gaze, once fixed on a distant point, slowly shifted to meet mine. A small smile crept across his face. "Hello, Emma," he said softly. My blood ran cold. I hadn't revealed my name to him. My name badge lay concealed beneath my jacket. I made it a point to keep it covered during the night shift, a simple safety measure. Yet, he was aware. He knew my name. How does he know my name? I found the courage to speak, my voice barely rising above a whisper. He didn't respond by himself. He maintained that hollow smile, his gaze locked onto mine. I retreated cautiously, my hands shaking with unease. I felt an overwhelming urge to dash to the back room, to call the police, to take action. Yet I was frozen in place. His stare held me captive like a helpless mouse. "Beware of the snake's gaze. You need to exercise more caution," his voice finally remarked. "Clara, behind the glass, you never know who might be observing you." I hurried to the back office, my hands trembling with anxiety. As I struggled to dial 911, my heart raced, and by the time I finally got through, I was breathless and panicking. The operator attempted to soothe my nerves as I hurriedly conveyed the situation, my words tumbling out in a rush. By the time the police showed up, he was long gone. The area was thoroughly searched, yet nothing was discovered. They recorded my statement and assured me that they would boost patrols in the area, yet I could see on their faces that they weren't taking him seriously. Just another night worker scared by a stranger harmless. But he wasn't harmless. I knew it in my bones. The next night I was tense. From the moment my shift started, every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat to me. When 2 o'clock struck, I found myself staring at the windows, waiting. I wasn't disappointed. This time something was different. I was closer to the glass, just enough so I could see his face clearly under the fluorescent light. He was looking straight at me, that same empty smile on his lips. "I missed you," Emma said loud enough for me to hear him from across the counter. "You missed me." I didn't answer. I already had my hand on the phone, ready to call the police again. "I know you're scared." She continued to put a hand against the glass. "But you don't have to be. I just want to talk. We have a lot in common, you and I." "Leave me in peace," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to call the police," he laughed, a hollow sound that made me shudder. "They won't understand, they never do. But I understand you, Emma, everything about you." To prove her point, she started reciting details about my life, where I lived, what car I drove, my favorite coffee shop, my cat's name. Things I couldn't know, things I shouldn't know. With every new detail, I felt my world getting smaller. more dangerous, like I tried to ask, but my voice failed me. "I've been watching you," I said simply, as if that explained everything for a long time. "Only you never noticed me." Before, I grabbed the phone and dialed 911 again. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold it. He saw me do it and kept smiling. "They won't make it in time," he said softly. "They never do, but don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you, not yet. I just want you to know that I'm here, that I'll always be here watching you." She turned away from the glass, still smiling. "See you tomorrow." Emma, this time when she walked away, I knew she wasn't done with this. It was just the beginning. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't stand another night wondering if she'd show up, if she was waiting for me, if she knew even more about me. I moved to the other side of the eye, changed my phone number. I tried my best to disappear. But sometimes late at night I see a silhouette outside my window. Just a shadow, a hint of a figure in the dark, and although I never get to see his face clearly, I know it's him, still watching, still waiting. I've learned to keep the curtains closed, to vary my routine, to always look over the shoulder. I've learned that the scariest monsters aren't the ones chasing you. They're the ones waiting, the ones watching, the ones that know your name even though you've never told them, because that's the problem with empty spaces. Once something fills them, you never see them the same again. Every window becomes a point of observation. Every shadow can hide a viewer. Every stranger could be him, waiting for the perfect moment to remind me what's next. I don't work night shifts there. I can't stand the silence anymore, the loneliness, the way darkness turns windows into mirrors. But even in broad daylight, even in the middle of a crowd, I sometimes feel their eyes on me. And when I walk past a convenience store at night, I can't help but stare at the windows, looking for that familiar silhouette, because I know it's still there, still watching, still waiting. And worst of all, he was right about something. The police never understood how could anyone understand the terror of being observed, really watched by someone who knows everything about you, but he's still a complete stranger. How do you explain? How does it change you? How does it make every private moment seem like one? How does it make every casual look seem like a threat? You can't just do what I did, run, hide, pray because one day they find someone else to look up to, but deep down you know the truth. Once someone like him chooses you, he never lets go of you completely. He becomes part of your story, a shadow in your peripheral vision, a presence that can never shake completely. So here I am, living my life, trying to pretend that everything is normal, but now I know better. I know that sometimes the real horror isn't in what could happen to you, it's in knowing that someone is out there, learning every detail of your life, waiting for the perfect moment to remind you that you're never really alone. Because in the end, that's it. The real fear, not the cheap scares, not the blood, not the noises in the night, is the slow, chilling certainty that your life is no longer completely yours, that someone else has claimed a part of it and made a home in your nightmares. And sometimes on particularly dark nights I find myself standing by my window staring out into the darkness, wondering if it's out there in this very moment watching me, waiting, smiling with that empty smile, 'cause I was right about something else. He'll always be here, even if I'm never to see him again, even if he's gone a long time ago. The fear he sowed in me has taken root, has become permanent. Something that's changed the way I see the world. Every window is now a portal for eyes that watch. Every stranger could be disguised. Every moment of tranquility I could be interrupted by that soft voice calling my name, reminding me that I'm never really alone. That's her true mark. Not the fear of what she might do to me, but the fear of what she's already done. She's changed the way I see the world. She's turned every safe space into a potential threat, every moment of loneliness into a moment of vulnerability, and somewhere I know she's smiling. Therefore, empty university campuses at night have their own kind of silence. It is not just tranquility. It is as if the buildings are holding their breath, waiting for the morning to bring back the avalanche of students and life. Usually that was comforting to me, until someone started leaving notes in my patrol car with information that knew too much about my life. I had been working in campus security for years, mainly in the night shift. The job was pretty straightforward, going around campus in a self-check buildings, making sure the doors were locked. Sometimes we would find drunk students, try to get into the pool, or couples looking for privacy. But most of the time it was just me and my thoughts. The first note popped up on any given Tuesday. I had just finished checking the science building when I noticed a folded paper under the windshield wiper. At first I thought it was just another advertising flyer, but when I took it, my blood froze. Written in impeccable handwriting, There were the details about my daughter's soccer practice, where she played, what position she occupied, even the color of her shoes. I stood there looking at the paper, trying to understand. I hadn't told anyone at work about my daughter's soccer. It wasn't something I mentioned in the break room. I looked around the empty parking lot, nothing, just shadows and the faint glow of the street lamps. The next night another note, this time about my wife's work in elementary school. Included details of her classroom that only someone who had been inside could know, the layout of her desk, the drawings her students had made of her, even the cup of coffee she used every morning. I began to vary my patrol routes to check more often the rear view mirrors, looking for someone following me, but the campus was always deserted, just dark buildings and empty hallways, and yet the grades kept showing up. Your son is improving in math. That Thursday tutor is helping him a lot. You should fix that loose tile on your roof before the rains come. Your mother called yesterday. You should call her back. You miss. Each note revealed something more personal, more private, things that no stranger should know. I started taking pictures of them, documenting times and locations, trying to find a pattern, but they would appear randomly, sometimes when I checked the buildings, other times during my breaks, other times when I had only turned my back for a few seconds. The security cameras were useless. They only showed my car parked, then an instant of static, and then the note was there, with no one approaching, without anyone walking away, as if they had appeared out of nowhere one night. The note was different. It contained no personal details, just 5 words that gave me goosebumps. I see you watching your family. I reported everything to my supervisor. I showed him the notes, the photos, the recording of the cameras, increased the patrols in my area, asked IT to check the cameras in case they had been tampered with, and even called the local police. But they found nothing without fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence of who was leaving the notes. After that the messages got darker. Your daughter left the window open last night. Anyone could have come in. Your wife works late on Wednesdays. You should be more careful in the parking lot. Your son takes the same way to school every day. Predictable. It wasn't just observations anymore, they were threats. Whoever was watching me. Music. Hide someone watching every strange. I could be the one who left the notes until the note came that tore me. You can't protect them all the time, but I can always keep an eye on them. Attached was a picture of my family having dinner taken through the kitchen window. That same night we were all there smiling, not knowing that we were being watched. The perspective meant that someone had been in our garden just outside the house while we were eating. That night I quit. Let's routinely pack everything. I got a day job where nothing is hidden in the shadows. But sometimes, even now, I find a note in my new car, in my mailbox under my door. They're different now. They don't contain threats or notice, just observations, as if whoever was watching me wanted me to know that they found us, that distance, no matter, that they'll always be there. Last week I found one in my pocket, my jacket, a pocket that was empty. That morning I just said, I'm still watching. I don't work at night anymore. I can't stand the thought of being alone in the dark, knowing that someone could be there learning every day of my life. But the worst thing is not the fear for me, is knowing that someone is still watching my family, collecting details about their lives, their habits, their moments of vulnerability, because that's what they do. Observe, learn, remember, and somewhere in the shadows between lampposts or in the spaces between houses, they keep watching, they keep learning, keep leaving notes that prove that no distance is enough, that no precaution is enough. I've installed security cameras, motion sensors, everything I can think of, but deep down I know it's no use, because whoever it is doesn't appear on the cameras, doesn't activate alarms, just observe and write and wait. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy, if maybe the stress of the night shift and an overactive imagination created all this. But then I find another note with some new detail about our lives, and I know it's real. The police can't help. What can they do against someone who leaves notes but never shows up on the cameras? My wife thinks I'm paranoid, that I see threats where I don't. Perhaps I'm right, perhaps I'm a bit unhinged, but I stand firm in my conviction about what I witnessed, the contents of those notes, and the undeniable truth that somewhere, someone is still watching, still absorbing, still chronicling every nuance of our existence. A lost suitcase invariably tells a tale. It might stem from a traveler's absent-mindedness or signify a life abruptly left behind. Yet, the red suitcase I stumbled upon by the emergency exit that fateful night was unlike any other. It wasn't merely lost. It was poised, waiting for me to discover it. This suitcase had been on the night shift at Riverside Airport for 8 months, a place not bustling with activity. Just a quaint regional airport hosting a handful of late flights and cargo planes. My role was straightforward. patrol the terminals, inspect the security gates, and ensure no one lingered where they shouldn't. Most nights unfolded without incident. Just me and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. The suitcase turned up on a Tuesday. It was hidden in a corner, near an emergency exit on the ground floor, partially hidden behind a trash can. At first glance it looked like forgotten luggage, something worn. Well, nothing special, but there was something strange about the way it was placed, almost as if someone had put it there on purpose. I approached cautiously nowadays. Not I can be too careful with bags abandoned at airports, but my gut was that this wasn't a security threat, it was something else. I checked if it had an ID tag, nothing but name, no address, no airline tags, just a common red suitcase with worn edges and a slightly crooked wheel. Following protocol, I took it to the lost and found office. That's when things got weird. Inside was only one object, a teddy bear. Not just any teddy bear, but an old worn-out one, with a single button eye barely hanging down. It looked like something that had been loved for decades. Carried through countless adventures and heartbreaks, I registered it in the system and tried to forget it. But the next night another suitcase appeared in the exact same place. This one was green, smaller, covered in scratches as if it had been dragged away by gravel again. Without identification again, I took her to Lost and found inside was a child's shoe, one only covered in mud, seemed to have gone through hell. Something in that shoe, solitaire, made my skin crawl. Why only one? Where was his pair, and by why leave it here in this specific place? The third night I almost didn't want to check that corner, but of course there was another suitcase. This one was different. An old leather briefcase with a broken zipper inside. There was a black and white photograph of a little girl standing alone in what looked like a backyard. Her expression was not normal, too empty, too inert. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I began to fearing my shifts. Every night I would bring a new suitcase, each with a single object carefully chosen to disturb me. A rusty key without a lock, a handwritten note in a language I didn't recognize, a small mirror that only reflected darkness. I checked the security cameras, but they showed nothing. No one left. The suitcases, no suspicious activity, was as if they appeared out of nowhere, materializing in that same place between my rounds. Then one night around 2 a.m., a figure caught my eye, standing just outside near the sidewalk of leg. Partially illuminated by the faint glow of the parking lot lights, they wore a dark coat, their hidden face obscured by a hood, and clutched a suitcase tightly. I observed through the glass doors as he drew near. He paused just outside, peering in, as if verifying something. My heart raced, yet I compelled myself to remain. Concealed in the shadows, he placed the suitcase on the ground with a sense of care, almost as if honoring it, before slipping away into the night. After ensuring it had truly disappeared, I cautiously approached the luggage, my hands trembling as I carried it to the lost and found office. Within, a wrinkled piece of paper bore 4 words scrawled in haphazard handwriting. "It's your turn." The following night, I came ready. I set my phone to capture the corner where the suitcases had shown up. I took additional laps, scrutinizing every shadow, resolute in my pursuit to uncover the one responsible for this. Yet, in a moment of distraction, another suitcase materialized before me. Inside was a mirror, but not just an ordinary one. As I peered into the mirror, my reflection stared back, but something felt off. My eyes were shut, vacant like the girl's in the photograph. I recoiled, slamming the suitcase shut. Night after night, the suitcases appeared, each more unsettling than the last. One contained a children's diary, every page repeating the same chilling sentence: "They are looking at us." Another held a set of keys that fit the locks in my apartment, and a recent photograph of me sleeping in my own bed. In that moment, clarity struck. I realized this was no coincidence. Whoever was leaving these suitcases knew me, had been watching, had invaded my space. These objects were not mere curiosities. They were ominous messages, warnings. One night, I heard a noise outside the lost and found office. As I glanced around, my eyes were drawn to a vibrant array of suitcases in the hallway, each varying in size and color, perfectly aligned and guiding the way to the emergency exit. My attention was captured by the last suitcase in the line, which began to open by itself. Inside, a mirror awaited, and in its reflection, I was startled to see a multitude of figures standing behind me. I was all dressed in dark coats, all faceless. I turned suddenly. The hallway was empty, but when I looked back in the mirror they were still there, watching me, waiting. I ran. I left everything behind, my jacket, my keys, my pride. I didn't stop until I got to my car, and I still felt watched. When I got home there was a suitcase waiting for me at my door. I didn't open it. I didn't want to know what message it contained. I gave up I worked the next day. I moved to another apartment. I changed my phone number, but I still find them little suitcases left in strange places outside my window, in the laundry room of my building, under my desk in my new job, always containing a single object, always telling a story I don't want to hear. Last week I found one in my closet, a small red suitcase. I know I didn't put it there. I've opened. I can't force myself to see what's inside. It's still there, now waiting, whispering in the dark, 'cause that's what they do. These suitcases wait there. Siren. They tell stories about eyes that watch, over empty faces, about things that follow you home at night. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be free from them, or if this is my life now, finding mysterious suitcases. Each one a chapter in a story that I never wanted to be in. A story about being watched, about being chosen, about being marked. The problem with lost suitcases is that they all tell a story, but some stories don't end. Some haunt you, torment you, change you, and sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I hear them. The soft scraping of wheels on the wood, the click of bolts, the whisper of stories waiting to be told. 'Cause they're still out there, drop-offs, still watching, still waiting, still leaving their messages in the dark corners of my world. And somewhere in a corner I haven't checked yet, another suitcase is waiting. Another story is ready to be told. Another part of my sanity is about to be reclaimed by whatever is watching me from the shadows. Always watching, always waiting, always collecting stories in forgotten suitcases. They say that each building has its own personality. After dark, a school becomes a maze of echoing corridors and creaking doors. A hospital transforms into a maze of dimly lit corridors and buzzing machines. But an office building, that's different. During the day it's all lights, FL entities and keyboard clicks. But at night it becomes something else, something hungry. I've been working as a janitor at Carlton and Associates for a few months when strange things started happening. The building itself was nothing special. 12 floors of cubicles, conference rooms and corner offices, all wrapped in glass and steel. My job was simple. Clean it, bathrooms, vacuum carpets, empty trash, basic tasks that kept me busy from midnight to dawn. The first incident was so small that I almost passed it. In the midst of restocking paper towels in the 4th floor bathroom, I inadvertently left my cleaning cart beside the elevators. When I returned, my bottle of window cleaner had moved from one side of the cart to the other. It hadn't fallen over, it hadn't tipped over. It had been deliberately moved, as if someone had picked it up and placed it in a different place. I dismissed it as a simple oversight. When you work alone at night, it's easy to doubt yourself. Maybe I'd moved it before and forgot. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But then it happened again. The next night with a roll of paper towels, and the next night with my phone. Little things easily explainable, except that they kept happening, and always when I had my back turned. I finished mopping a floor, turned to rinse the mop, and found my bucket 3 feet further to the left. I was leaving my supplies to open a door, and when I came back into sight they were arranged differently. Then I began to hear things, not the typical sounds of a building at night, such as the hum of the ventilation system, the occasional creaking of metal settling, or the distant rumble of night traffic. Were different trailing sounds, as if something was sliding on the carpet, soft taps that seemed to following me from room to room. And sometimes when I was alone in a large space I would hear what sounded like slow breathing. Ada, and it wasn't mine. I began to keep track of my supplies, arranging themselves in specific patterns to know if they moved. I took photos with my phone, documenting their positions before and after. Looking away, the changes were subtle but undeniable. A 45 gr spray bottle rotated, a mop leaning in the opposite direction. Small things but impossible. One night while cleaning the executive floor I caught something with my peripheral vision, a shadow moving on the carpet, low to the floor, as if someone was crawling. When I turned there was nothing. But when I checked my cart, everything had been rearranged again. I tried to tell my supervisor, but how do you explain something like that without sounding like a crazy boss? I think something is playing with my supplies. When I'm not looking, I'd probably think I was drinking at work or looking for an excuse to quit. So I kept quiet and started setting up my phone to record while I worked. The first few nights didn't pick up anything. Just me moving from room to room, the occasional wobble of shadows as the clouds passed over the moonlight. But then on the fifth night I caught something. I was cleaning the break room on the 7th floor when my phone recorded it on video. I'm seen cleaning the counters with my back to the door. Then something moves in the hallway. A dark figure goes down to the floor, moving in a way that's not quite right. It's like watching someone crawl, but the movements are too fluid, too smooth. The figure slides into the room right at the edge of the frame, and then the video cuts to static for 3 seconds when the IMAG returns. My supplies have been completely rearranged, and there is no trace of the figure. I saw that video 100 times trying to convince myself that it was a light trick or a camera failure, but deep down I knew what I had seen. Something was in the building with me. Something. I waited until I looked at something that was moving in ways that they weren't natural. After that, things escalated. I started hearing the sound of dragging on the windows, the whistling closer, now almost right behind me. Sometimes I felt a draft of cold air brushing my legs as if something had just happened. Crawling. The rearrangement of my supplies became more dramatic. Objects appeared upside down or stacked in impossible ways. Then came the night that changed it. I was all vacuuming the 10th floor. When the power went out, not just the lights, everything, the vacuum went out, the emergency lights didn't turn on, even my phone died. I was left in complete darkness, trying to orient myself when I heard it. The sound of Asa was now around the circle. I could hear the breathing, that same slow and deliberate breathing that I had heard before, but louder, closer. And then I saw them, eyes reflecting the little light coming in through the windows, low to the floor, moving in the darkness, and there were too many of them. I ran. I didn't care about my cart, my supplies, my work. I just ran, stumbling in the dark to where I thought the stairs were behind me. I could hear him moving, not running, but sliding across the floor with that unnatural softness, following me without. I slammed the stairwell door harder than I intended, almost falling down the first flight of stairs as I descended. I could hear him on the stairwell with me, not on the steps, on the walls, moving beside me, parallel to the ground, as if gravity didn't apply to him. He emerged downstairs, running to the main entrance. Just as I reached the doors, the lights came back. I turned, my heart beating, running amok, fearing what I might see. The hall was empty. There were no shadows. There were no eyes. There was nothing crawling on the walls, but my cleaning cart was there, right in the center of the floor. Each supply had been arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center was a single piece of paper written in a warped letter, as if someone who had only seen letters in a mirror had written it down. There were the words, "We've been watching you clean up, now it's your turn to watch us." I left everything there, the cart, the supplies, my building keys. I walked out and never came back. I emailed my resignation the next day. I found a new job in a small office where nothing moves when I'm not looking, but sometimes late at night when I'm home alone I hear that creeping sound or catch a flash of something moving under the edge of my vision, and I know I've been followed home by the observers, the crawlers, the things waiting until you turn your back. I've learned to live with it more or less. Now I keep my cleaning supplies under lock and key. I can't stand to see them moved. I've covered all the mirrors in my house, because sometimes I just see a reflection of something moving behind me. Something that it drags you in ways that shouldn't be possible. They say that every building has its own personality after dark, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes that personality follows you home. Sometimes it watches you, it studies you, it learns from you, and sometimes when you least expect it, it reminds you that you're never really alone, because they keep watching, they keep waiting, they keep crawling in the dark just out of your sight. And every once in a while, when I'm about to fall asleep, I hear that soft shuffling sound. I feel that draft of cold air brushing against my legs, and I know they're still there, still watching, still learning, crawling forever in the spaces where we dare not look. I don't clean anymore. I can't stand the thought of turning my back on an empty room. But I know they're still there, in office buildings, in schools, in hospitals, waiting for the lights to go out, waiting for someone new to watch. And sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, I wonder if they found someone else yet, or if I'll always be their favorite subject, the janitor who saw too much, the one who learned what really happens when you turn your back on the darkness. Because that's the problem with darkness, it's not empty. It's full of eyes that observe, of shadows creeping from things moving in ways they shouldn't, and once you know you can't ignore it, you can just watch and hope and pray that they don't decide to do anything other than reorganize your cleaning supplies. 2 months after I started working as a security guard in the downtown parking lot, I realized something. Footsteps sound different when they're not yours. It has a distinct pace when walking, a pattern you can recognize. But the footsteps I started hearing on level 3, Those didn't sound human at all. The parking lot itself was nothing special, 5 levels of concrete and fluorescent lights, almost empty after midnight, save for the odd night worker or late theater spectator. My shift was from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. And on most nights, it truly was. They conducted rounds, monitoring the cameras and ensuring that no one attempted to access other people's vehicles. The booth I worked in was cozy yet efficient, featuring a row of monitors displaying the security cameras positioned around the parking lot. While the cameras left much to be desired, plagued by dead zones and grainy footage, they still offered a semblance of security. Better than having no surveillance at all, or so I believed. Before the steps began, the first time I heard them during a patrol routine in Level 3, it was around 2 o'clock, that dead hour of the night when the world seems to hold its breath. The sound came from somewhere behind me, steady and measured steps that seemed to follow mine but were not quite synchronized. I turned with the flashlight held high, cutting through the darkness, but the level was empty, just rows of parked cars and pillars of concrete, casting long shadows. I stood there for a moment listening, but the footsteps had surely stopped. An echo, I said to myself. The sound plays tricks in places like this, but the next night they came back the same level, same time, same disturbing rhythm. Only this time they seemed closer, sharper when I turned to look, glimpsing between the cars, just a shadow, but enough to make my heart race. "Hello," I called, trying to keep my voice firm. "Security. Someone there." Nothing, just the hum of the lights and the murmur of traffic on the street. I did a full level check, checking between each car, but I found nothing. I went back to my cab and checked the cameras. The Level 3 recording showed nothing unusual, just me making my rounds, stopping, looking around. But something caught my attention. Every so often the screen flashed like if there was interference, and in those moments, I would swear something was moving in the background. Something barely noticeable, something that seemed to be watching me. The footsteps became a nocturnal occurrence, always on Level 3, always around 2 in the morning. Sometimes they followed me only for a few minutes, other times they echoed throughout the level. For hours I began to dread that part of my rounds, but I couldn't skip it. It was my job, checking each level one night, determined to find out who or what was behind this. I turned off my flashlight and waited in the shadows. The parking lot was eerily quiet, that kind of silence that seems to press against your ears. Then I heard footsteps coming from the ramp going up from Level 2, but they were different, this time slower, more deliberate, as if whoever made them wanted me to hear them. I held my breath, watching the ramp, waiting to see who would show up, but no one did. The footsteps made it all the way to the top, but there was no one there. They continued to move down the level, passing right next to where I was hiding, but I didn't see anyone, just the sound of pee on the concrete moving through the empty air. That night I broke down, ran back to my cabin and locked the door, my hands shaking as I tried to call my supervisor, but the line was dead and my phone had no signal. I looked at the security monitors. Level 3 was still empty. Everything seemed normal, but then the cameras started flashing one by one. The monitors filled with static, and when the image came back I saw it, a figure standing in the center of Level 3. It was dark and slightly blurred, like a shadow that had peeled off the wall. While I was looking at the figure, he turned slowly towards the camera. I couldn't make out features, but I knew he was looking at me through the screen, through the grain of the image. I felt his gaze. The figure raised a hand, beckoned me to come closer. The monitors went off when they turned back on. The figure had disappeared, but the footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them now, echoing on the staircase next to my cabin, slowly climbing up from Level 3. I froze as they got closer and closer. The doorknob started to spin slowly. I deliberately wanted to run, scream, do something, but my body wasn't responding. The door opened. The staircase was empty, but the footsteps continued. They entered the cabin. I heard them move around me. I felt a presence behind me, cold, antique. Wrong. Something touched my shoulder, not a hand, but something that I was trying to be a hand. "We've been watching you," whispered a voice. I couldn't tell if I heard it with my ears or inside my head. "Learning your patterns, your routines, your fears." I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that none of this was happening. When I opened them again, the presence had disappeared. The footsteps were moving away, going down again to Level 3. That same night I resigned, left my badge on the desk, and I left. I didn't even wait for my replacement to arrive as I ran to my car. The footsteps kept matching my pace, step by step, until the exit. That marks the conclusion. 3 months have passed. Since then I have a new job, Now during the day in a small office, where the only footsteps I hear are those of my coworkers, but sometimes late at night when I'm in bed, I hear those deliberate measured footsteps moving around my apartment as if they were still. I have learned to live with it. More or less accepted that whatever was in that parking lot followed me home. Sometimes I see it in the reflections of windows or mirrors. A dark figure, and still observing, still learning, still trying to understand what it means to be human. The footsteps never completely disappeared. They are smoother, now more distant, but they are always there, following me in supermarkets, on city streets, in empty aisles, learning my new patterns, my new routines. Last week via a new security guard in the parking lot, a young guy, probably his first night shift. As I drove by, I looked at level 3 in the rearview mirror. There was a figure standing there, dark, blurred, watching the new guard make his rounds. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him about the footsteps on the figure in the cameras, on the thing that follows you home, but who would believe me? So I keep driving, and every night I wonder. I already heard them, the footsteps that don't sound quite human, the presence that observes and learns and follows, because that's what they do: observe, learn, follow. And somewhere in that parking lot on level 3 at 2 in the morning, the footsteps continue. Mark was never well since. The principle. Anyone who has worked the night shift long enough develops a kind of sixth sense for people, and something about it set off all my alarms. It wasn't obvious at first. It was the way I always observed, as if I was studying a dam instead of doing his job. I had been working the factory night shift for almost 3 years. It wasn't a glamorous job, keeping the equipment, monitoring production lines, making sure everything was running smoothly until the morning shift came. The building was huge, an old manufacturing plant with high ceilings, lighting, and the constant hum of the machinery most of the time. We were just 5 people scattered throughout the facility, each with their assigned area. That meant long periods of loneliness, interrupted only by radio checks or the occasional maintenance call. I was used to it. I even liked it until Mark arrived. He was new. He had been on shift for about 2 weeks when I noticed his habit. He was working on a machine, focused on my task. When I felt a chill down the back of my neck, when I looked up, there he was, half hidden behind a piece of equipment, watching me. He wasn't doing anything else. He wasn't pretending to be busy. He was just watching. I pretended not to notice it, and I went on with my work. Maybe it was just a weird guy. Maybe he didn't know how to socialize, but there was something in his look that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else, something hungry. One night I was calibrating a sensor on the upper level when I saw him downstairs, hidden behind a conveyor belt. He wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking. He was just there with his head tilted up, staring at me. I yelled at him, "You need something." His response was immediate: "Number, just observe." And the way he said it, like it was the most normal thing in the world, like he didn't understand how weird it was. I felt a chill down my spine. I finished my work as fast as I could, and went to another section, but I could feel his eyes following me. After that it got worse. He showed up everywhere. If I went to the maintenance room for tools, he was at the door. If I checked a line of production, he was already in the hallway, watching me from above. Sometimes I would see him disappear behind a machine just as I turned to look at him. The most disturbing thing seemed to know exactly where he was going to be before he arrived. If he had to check a piece of equipment in a remote corner of the factory, he was already there, waiting, as if he knew my routine better than I did. I tried to talk to my supervisor, but how do you explain something like that? The new "he's looking at me weird" sounded ridiculous, and Mark never crossed the line of menacing, never got too close, never said anything out of place, just watched. Then came the night that changed everything. It was my turn to make the rounds in the East Wing, an old section of the factory now only used for storage. Lighting was bad, too many shadows, too dark corners. I turned a corner when I stopped in dry. Mark was there waiting for me, standing at the end of the hallway, completely motionless, but something was wrong. His posture was strange. His head was tilted at an impossible angle, yet in the distance I could see the twinkle of his eyes in the gloom. "Have you ever felt watched?" he asked. His voice sounded distorted in the empty hallway, as if space itself stretched it, as if someone was learning everything about you piece by piece. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry. My instinct was screaming at me to run. "I've been watching you." I kept stepping forward, learning your patterns, your habits, how you move, how you work. It's fascinating how predictable humans can be. The way he pronounced humans like he wasn't one. I felt a chill climb up my spine. I said one step back. My hand reached for my radio, but before I could take it, He smiled. Too many teeth won't make it in time, she whispered. Never do, no, in such a big place, with so many hiding places. She took another step forward, and in the gloom her face changed the empty expression. She always had. Something else disappeared. She was replaced by something wild, something hungry. I ran. I didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care if it sounded paranoid. I just ran. My footsteps rumbled against the concrete, mixing with the hum of the machinery and the echo of my own breathing I could hear behind me. Not running, walking calmly as if I knew it would eventually catch me. I got to the main floor, zigzagging between the machines, trying to lose it, but every time I looked over my shoulder, there it was, sometimes in front of me, sometimes behind, sometimes up in the elevated hallways. It was impossible. I couldn't be in so many places at once. I finally made it to the living room. Tom, another operator, consistently took his break. I knew I would find him there at that time, but when I opened the door, the room was vacant. A half-eaten sandwich rested on the table, accompanied by an open thermos, steam still rising from its spout. As Mark's voice echoed in my ears, I felt a surge of panic wash over me. Where was Tom? As he climbed onto my chest, he departed early, feeling unwell. He obstructed the doorway, his shadow stretching beneath the harsh fluorescent light. I kept going. There, wider, more wrong. What do you want? I managed to ask, my voice just a whisper. Understand. She tilted her head, her neck crackled in a way that didn't seem natural. To learn to observe. You're more interesting when you think no one is watching you. My hand trembled as she reached for a chair, using it as a barrier between us. Get away from me. I'm going to call security. She laughed, a hollow sound. Without emotion. Do it, but they won't understand what they see. They never do. I tried dialing on my phone, but before I could press the button, the lights flashed and went out. Total darkness, just the sound of his breathing and the crackling of his footsteps approaching. You don't want to know what I've learned about you, he whispered. You don't want to know what I know. The emergency generators turned on, the red lights flashed, trying to focus the view. Mark was right in front of me, just a few inches away. His face wasn't human anymore, or at least not quite. I screamed, grabbed the chair and threw it at him, ran without looking back, didn't stop until I got to my car from the parking lot, called my supervisor and quit on the spot. He tried to convince me to stay, that I'd talk to human resources, but I knew that wouldn't change a thing. Why? How do you explain something like that? The new guy isn't human. It's not something you can put in a report. I got another daytime job, a small factory on the other side of town. But I still see him sometimes in the crowds, on street corners, in the rearview mirror of my car, always watching, always waiting. I wonder if he found anyone else to study, or if I'm still his favorite subject. The worst is the uncertainty. He was just a man disturbed, or something else, something that wears human skin, like a poorly fitting costume. I'll never know, but I learned the shadows, write down the empty spaces where someone might be hiding, because somewhere he's still there, observing, learning, waiting, and sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I feel his eyes on me, studying, analyzing, waiting for the perfect time to get closer again, because that's what that does. It's the essence of an unseen watcher, absorbing our rhythms, our routines, our vulnerabilities, perhaps biding time until the perfect moment to reveal its true identity.